She was 3 months along when she learned the wedding date had been set not from him, but from a society column in the Tribune, sandwiched between a gala announcement and a restaurant review, as though the end of everything they had been was just another item on the city's calendar. Celeste Harmon read it twice. Standing in her kitchen in Boston at 7 in the morning with a cup of tea, she had stopped drinking halfway through because the smell of black tea had been making her nauseated for 6 weeks, and she kept forgetting. The column was small, 3 sentences. A photograph of a couple at what appeared to be a recent charity event. The woman in gold, with her hand on the arm of a man whose profile Celeste knew better than she had ever intended to know anything. Dominic Voss, 34, heir to the Voss family's interests across the eastern seaboard. To be wed in a spring ceremony to Isadora Rhine of the Boston-based Rhine family. In what sources close to both families describe as a union years in the making. She set her phone face down on the counter and stood with her hands flat on the granite and looked out the window at the November street below, where a woman was walking a dog in the kind of determined, head-down way that Bostonians walked when it was cold and they had somewhere to be. She thought about all the things Darian had not said in the last 4 months, and she thought about the shape of all those unsaid things, and she thought that silence, in the right hands, was the most precise instrument in the world. He had known, and he had not said. And she had spent 12 weeks building a wall around the fact of what was growing inside her, telling herself she was waiting for the right moment. And the right moment had apparently been printed in the Chicago Tribune on a Tuesday morning for the city to read over their coffee. She had met Dominic Voss 11 months ago at a conference, an urban planning symposium in Chicago that her firm had sent her to on short notice, because the senior partner who was supposed to attend had a family emergency. She had been tired and underprepared and annoyed about it, and she had arrived at the opening reception with a badge that still had the senior partner's name crossed out and hers written in marker, and she had reached for the same glass of sparkling water at the same moment as a man in a charcoal suit who looked at the badge, then at her face, and said, "Which one are you?" She had told him. He had told her his name, which she did not recognize, and they had talked for 40 minutes about structural frameworks in adaptive reuse architecture, which was her specialty. And she had not thought about him again until the next morning, when he was sitting 3 seats down from her in the opening panel and had turned, once, to catch her eye across the room with the specific quality of a person confirming something they had noted the night before. She still did not know who he was. She found out at lunch, when the conference director sat down beside her and mentioned, casually, that it was unusual to have a Voss in the room. They typically sent intermediaries to these things, not the heir himself. She had looked across the dining room to where Darian was listening to someone speak with the precise, contained attention she had already catalogued in the 40 minutes at the reception, and she had thought, that explains the suit. It had not explained anything else about him, and she had spent the following 8 months trying to understand the rest. And in those 8 months, she had arrived at the conclusion that he was the most genuinely complicated person she had ever been close to, and she had also arrived in his bed in a Chicago hotel room on a Thursday in March, and in his arms in a North Shore house she had not known he owned on a Sunday in June, and in a restaurant in the South End, with her hand across the table covered by his restaurant on a night in August when it had rained for 6 hours straight, and neither of them had said the obvious thing. The obvious thing was that it would end. She had known it from the reception, from the conference director's voice when she said the name Voss, from the quality of Darian's attention that was simultaneously focused and already managing something she could not see. He had never lied to her. He had simply never said the things that would have required her to make a decision earlier than she was ready to make one, and she had never asked, because asking would have required acknowledging what she already knew. And what she already knew was that a man like Dominic Voss did not get to choose who he was with the ease that other men did. She had told herself this was enough, the Thursday hotel rooms and the Sunday house and the August rain. She had told herself right up until the morning 6 weeks ago, when she had sat on the bathroom floor with a test in her hand and understood that something she had not decided had been decided for her by the particular carelessness of a night in September, when they had both said, in the language of people who don't want to stop, that it would be fine. It was not fine, but it was not nothing, either. And that was the part she had not figured out what to do with. She called her sister, Nina, who was the person she called when she had information she needed to say aloud before she could understand it. Nina lived in Portland and taught middle school science and had an opinion about everything, which was usually exhausting and was sometimes exactly what Celeste needed. She answered on the second ring with the wariness of someone who recognized a 7 a.m. call as a category of information. Celeste told her about the Tribune column. Nina was quiet for a moment and then said, "When are you going to tell him I don't know?" Celeste said, "Celeste, I know. You're 12 weeks. I know." Nina exhaled the way she exhaled when she was deciding not to say the thing she most wanted to say. "What are you going to do?" Celeste looked out the window at the November street. "I'm going to go to work," she said, "and I'm going to think about it." "That is the least useful answer," Nina said. "I know," Celeste said, for the third time, and meant it, and hung up. She went to work. She did not think about it, or rather, she thought about it in the specific way of someone who was thinking about something else, with all the focus they had, while the primary thing ran, its quiet calculations in the background, like a program running behind every other window on a screen. She had a presentation at 10 for the Harborview project, the adaptive reuse conversion of a 19th century warehouse in the seaport that had been her primary work for the past year, and she got through it with the performance she had developed for professional settings, focused, specific, the exact right amount of enthusiasm, and she was packing up her materials when her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. She answered out of reflex. A man's voice, careful and professional, introduced himself as calling from a law office she had never heard of, asking if she was Celeste Harmon. And when she confirmed it, he said that he had been asked to reach out regarding a trust account that had been established in her name, and that if she had a moment, he could walk her through the details. She stood in the conference room with her laptop bag over one shoulder and said, "I don't have a trust account." The man said, "You do. As of approximately 3 weeks ago. It was established by an anonymous client acting through our firm. We've been asked to confirm the account details with you and ensure you have access." She said. "Who is the client?" he said. "I'm not at liberty to say." She said, "Then I'm not interested," and ended the call. She stood in the empty conference room for a long moment after that, with the phone in her hand and the specific cold feeling of a thing confirming what you had already suspected. 3 weeks ago, which meant before the Tribune column, before the announcement, before she had a number or a date, or any of the information that made the situation feel concrete in a way that required action. Someone had known for at least 3 weeks that she would need resources she did not currently have access to, and had made arrangements without asking her. The only person who would have reason to do that, and the means to do it through an anonymous third-party law firm, was the person whose wedding announcement she had read over undrinkable tea that morning. She thought he knew. He knew before I read the column. And instead of calling me, he hired a lawyer to establish a trust account in my name, which is the single most Darian Voss response to a complicated situation that it is possible to imagine. She thought this without warmth and without coldness, only with the particular exhaustion of loving someone whose first instinct in a crisis was to solve the logistics and leave the conversation for later. Later, apparently, was the Tribune column on a Tuesday morning. She tried calling him that evening. The call went to voicemail after 3 rings, which was different from the call going to voicemail after 1 ring, which meant he had seen her name on the screen and made a decision. She did not leave a message. She sat on her couch with her laptop and pulled up the Tribune article again and looked at the photograph. At the way Isadora Rhine stood beside him, with her hand on his arm with the ease of someone who had been positioned there by rehearsal rather than instinct. And she looked at Darian's profile, the particular set of his jaw that she had learned to read as the expression he wore when he was in a room where he had to be and would rather be somewhere else, and she thought that he looked exactly like what he was, a man with a plan that was not his own, executing it with the precision he applied to everything, giving nothing away. She did not try calling again. She spent the next 3 days organizing, because organizing was what she did when she could not control the thing she needed to control. She organized her finances. She researched the options available to a single woman with her income and her health insurance and her specific situation. She called her OB and scheduled the anatomy scan for 3 weeks out. She told her colleague Priya that she would be taking on the Harborview project as sole lead and not the team lead they had originally discussed, because she needed the billing structure to change. She did not tell Priya why. She did not tell anyone why. She was still in the phase of managing information in the way that she managed architectural complexity, one load at a time, one system at a time. Nothing introduced that the existing structure could not bear. On the 3rd day, at 4:30 in the afternoon, she looked up from her drafting screen and Darian Voss was standing outside the glass wall of her office. He was in a different suit from the Tribune photograph, darker, more severe, the kind of suit he wore when he had come from something that required it, which most things in his life did. He was not looking at the glass. He was looking at her, through it. In the way he looked at things, he was deciding whether he was ready for, which was the closest Darian ever got to uncertainty. Not the uncertainty itself, but the moment before the decision to step past it. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she reached over and pressed the button that frosted the glass of her office wall, which was the architectural equivalent of a closed door. And she picked up her phone and texted him, "Give me 5 minutes." He texted back, "Immediately." "I'll wait," as if she had suggested he might not. She spent the 5 minutes doing exactly what she told herself she would do, breathing, ordering the things she needed to say by priority, deciding which ones she was going to say tonight and which ones could wait until she understood what he had come to say first. She had learned this from architecture, from the understanding that a structure did not reveal all of its problems at once, and that the order in which you addressed them mattered as much as the addressing itself. She pressed the button again, and the glass cleared, and she stood up and opened the door and said, "Come in." He came in. He looked at her with the look she had first catalogued in the conference room, the look that was simultaneously taking in information and managing its impact. And then he looked at her face more specifically, and whatever he saw there made something shift behind his expression, not softness, not exactly, but a quality of recognition that was more honest than his usual management. He said, "You read the column 3 days ago." She said, "I tried to call. I know. You didn't answer." "No." She looked at him for a moment. "You established a trust account in my name," she said, 3 weeks before the column ran. He did not deny it. The timing was, he started. Deliberate, she said. Yes, he said, and the word cost him something she could see in the small tension around his jaw. The tell she had learned in 11 months, and that he probably did not know she had learned. I needed to make sure Darian. He stopped. She sat down because her back had been hurting since the 2nd month, and standing for long periods was getting uncomfortable in a way she was not going to explain to him right now. You needed to make sure I had what I needed, she said, without asking me what I needed. You wouldn't have accepted it if I'd asked, he said, which was true, and was not the point, and she could see that he knew it. Why are you here? She said. He looked at her across the office. With the drafting screen behind her, showing the Harborview warehouse and the November street outside the glass, and 12 weeks and 3 days between them that neither of them had managed correctly. Because I couldn't not be, he said. It was, she realized, the most unmanaged thing he had said to her in 11 months. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Tell me the one thing you came here to say. Not the logistics. Not the arrangements. The one thing." He was quiet for a moment that was exactly long enough to tell her he had prepared several things and was discarding all of them in favor of the true one. "I don't want you to disappear," he said. "That's what I came to say." She received it. She sat with it. She thought about the trust account and the anonymous lawyer and the 3 days of not answering her calls and the Tribune column and the hand on his arm in the photograph and the specific architecture of a man who solved logistics to avoid conversations. And she thought that "I don't want you to disappear" was simultaneously the most and least he could offer right now. And it was honest. Which was the thing about Darian that had kept her in this for 11 months when she should have known better. "I'm not going anywhere tonight," she said. "That's all I can tell you right now." He nodded, and she could see that he understood this was its own kind of answer, not the answer he had come for, but the one the situation warranted, and that he would take it. "Come with me," he said, "to Chicago, not to the house, somewhere else. 2 days. She looked at him. "Why?" "Because we need to talk," he said, "and we can't do it here, where you can stand up and end the conversation when it gets to the part you don't want to hear." It was the most accurate thing he had said about her in 11 months, possibly ever, and she hated that he had said it in the same sentence as the thing he was asking her to do. 2 days, she said. He said, 2 days. She looked out the frosted glass at the Boston evening going dark, at the street she had organized her life on for 3 years, at the city she had built a version of herself in that did not include the person sitting across from her or the 12.5 weeks of consequence that she was carrying home on the Red Line every night. "I'll book a flight for Friday," she said. He said, "I'll send the car." "I'll book a flight," she said again. He understood what that meant, her terms, her timeline, her ability to leave, and he nodded, and that was how it was agreed. She called Nina from the cab home and told her she was going to Chicago for the weekend to talk to Darian. Nina was quiet for a moment in the way that meant she had several things to say and was choosing the order. "Is that a good idea?" she said finally. "No," Celeste said. "Probably not." Then why Celeste looked out the cab window at the Charles River moving dark and cold under the bridge, at the city, doing what cities did at night, continuing, indifferent, enormous. "Because he came to Boston," she said. "He got on a plane and came to my office and stood outside the glass and waited," Nina said. "That's not nothing." "No," Celeste said. "It's not nothing." She looked at the river until the bridge ended and the city closed back in. She thought about 12 weeks and a trust account and a law firm she had never heard of and a man who had said I couldn't not be here, as though it were a fact of physics rather than a choice. and she thought that the difference between what she should do and what she was going to do was, in this case, the difference between the building on the blueprint and the building as it was, actually built, never perfectly the same, always negotiating with the conditions it found, rather than the conditions it had planned for. She had spent 5 years getting good at that negotiation. She thought she was going to need it now more than she had ever needed it. She did not sleep well that night or the night after. She went to the office. She worked on the Harborview project. She ate the things her body had decided it would tolerate this week, which were saltines and apples and, inexplicably, the particular brand of ginger tea sold by the cafe on the ground floor of her building. She did not look at the Tribune column again. She did not call Darian. She packed a bag on Thursday night with the specific discipline of someone who was not going to overpack, because overpacking implied a longer stay than she had agreed to, and she took the 7 a.m. flight on Friday morning, and she was in Chicago by 9:15, and she took a cab from O'Hare rather than the car service she knew Darian had probably arranged, and she texted him the address he had given her from the back of the cab, and she looked out the window at the city, coming into view, the skyline assembling itself above the expressway, gray and specific in November light, and she thought that the last time she had been in Chicago it had been September, and she and Darian had been on the same side of a situation they both understood and neither of them acknowledged. And now the situation had changed in a way that required acknowledgement, and she was the only one of the two of them who was going to be able to make that happen. And that was both the problem and the reason she was here. The address was a building in River North, a mid-rise, well-maintained, the kind of residential building that was expensive without performing its expense, the sort of place that was chosen for discretion rather than display. The lobby had a doorman who knew her name, which she had expected. The elevator required a key for the 8th floor, which she had not expected, and the doorman produced it from an envelope that had her name on it, in handwriting she recognized. She stood in the elevator with the key in her hand and thought about a man who anticipated her logistics even when she insisted on managing them herself, and she could not decide if this was consideration or control, and she thought it was probably both, and that the both of it was the most honest summary of Darian Voss that anyone could offer. The apartment was on the 8th floor, and it was not large, a living room, a kitchen, a bedroom, a view of the river from the west window, and it was furnished in the spare, decided way of a place that was used rather than lived in, and it was empty when she arrived, which meant Darian was not there yet, which gave her 20 minutes alone in the space before he arrived, and she used them the way she used every space she entered. For the first time she walked through it. She looked at the proportions. She stood at the west window and looked at the river, and she thought about what the space was designed to do and whether it was doing it. It was designed for privacy. It had no art on the walls and no personal objects visible and no indication that it belonged to anyone specifically, which meant it belonged to someone very specifically, to the version of Darian Voss that existed outside the Voss family's requirements, the version she had been permitted to know for 11 months. The version that did not appear in Tribune society, columns beside women in gold dresses. She stood at the river window with her bag at her feet and her coat still on, and the November Chicago light coming through the glass, and she placed her hand on her abdomen in the way she had started doing privately, unconsciously, and she thought, we're here. Let's see what he says. Darian arrived at 9:47. She heard the elevator key before she heard anything else, the particular sound of the mechanism releasing, then his footsteps on the hardwood in the hallway. And then he was in the doorway of the living room, and he stopped when he saw her still in her coat at the window, and neither of them spoke for a moment. He looked the way he looked when he had been in meetings since before dawn, which she suspected was the case. The suit was present, but the quality of his attention was slightly compressed, worn at the edges in a way that was only visible if you knew what his full attention looked like and could therefore recognize its diminishment. She had learned to read the difference. She did not say anything about it. "You took a cab," he said. "I told you I would," she said. He nodded and set his jacket on the chair nearest the door, the chair positioned exactly where you would set something if you intended to leave. Again, quickly. And she noticed that he noticed her noticing. And that was already more communication than they had managed in 4 months. Which was something. "Are you hungry?" he said. "I ate on the plane," she said, which was a lie. She had not been able to eat on the plane because the recycled air had smelled like someone's cologne, and her stomach had spent the entire flight staging. A protest, but she was not ready to let him organize her food yet. Because once he started organizing things, it became very difficult to stop him, and she needed the conversation to happen before the logistics did. He looked at her for a moment, and she thought he suspected the lie, but he did not push it. "Come sit down," he said, gesturing toward the couch. She came away from the window. She sat. He sat across from her, not beside her, which was the right choice, and she did not tell him so. He said, "Tell me what you want to say first." It was the first time in 11 months that he had asked her to go first, instead of presenting her with a structure and asking her to respond to it. She looked at him across the river apartment with the gray Chicago light between them, and she said, "I want to know whether you've been protecting me or managing me, because from where I've been standing for the last 4 months, I can't tell the difference." The silence that followed was the most honest silence she had heard from him. He did not reach for a quick answer. He did not reframe the question. He sat with it for a moment that was long enough to tell her he was not going to give her the diplomatic version. "Both," he said. "At different times." She received that. "Which one?" she said. "Was the trust account?" He met her eyes. "Protection," he said. "The worst kind. The kind that doesn't ask." She looked at him and thought that was the most accurate thing he had ever said about himself, and she thought that accuracy, at this stage, was worth more than comfort. "All right," she said. "Then start from the beginning. The real beginning. Not the version you've already edited." He leaned forward, his forearms on his knees, and he began to talk. And outside the river window, Chicago held itself in November gray. And the two of them sat in the apartment that was designed for privacy and had no art on its walls. And the baby that neither of them had acknowledged between them, yet was present in every word and in every silence, and in the particular quality of the attention they were both paying, which was the attention of 2 people who understood that what was said in the next several hours was going to determine the shape of everything that came after. The real beginning, as Darian told it, started not with the conference or the 11 months, but with something older, with the understanding that had been in place since he was 17 years old, and his father had sat him down in the Voss family's study on the North Shore and explained, with the particular clarity of a man who had been preparing this speech for years, that Darian's life was going to serve 2 purposes simultaneously. The first was his own. The second was the family's. And the family's purpose was not abstract. It was specific, estructural, load-bearing, in the way that actual architecture was load-bearing, meaning that if certain things were removed, other things would fall. The Rhine Alliance had been in discussion since Darian was in his mid-20s. Not a formal arrangement at that point. Not binding, but understood the way the tides of certain things in their world were understood before they became official. He had known about it. He had managed it the way he managed most things that were inevitable and disagreeable, by not looking at it directly, by occupying himself with the work, by keeping the personal and the professional in the separate compartments that his world required and that he had always been skilled at maintaining. And then he had met Celeste Harmon at a conference on a Wednesday evening, reaching for the same glass of sparkling water. And the compartments had developed a structural problem he had not anticipated and had not known how to address without making it worse. "You should have told me," Celeste said. She said it without heat, because she had made the decision on the flight from Boston that she was not going to perform anger she had already processed privately, that she was going to use this conversation for information rather than for theater. "I know," he said. "I didn't tell you because he stopped." She waited. This was one of the things she had learned about Darian. He did not stop mid-sentence accidentally. When he stopped, it was because he had arrived at the edge of something honest and was deciding whether to step past it. He stepped past it, because telling you would have required me to choose between you and the arrangement before I was ready to make that choice, he said, and I was not ready. And I knew that not being ready was something I did not have the right to ask you to accommodate. She looked at him. "But you asked me to accommodate the result of it instead," she said. "Yes," he said, which was worse. "Yes," he said again, and the repetition of yes without defense or elaboration was something she was going to need to sit with, because it was the kind of honesty that felt like both an answer and a question, and she had not yet decided what question it was asking. She looked out the river window for a moment, at the city doing its November thing, and then she looked back at him and said, "There's something I need to tell you." He looked at her. "I know," he said. She looked at him sharply. He said, "I've known for 6 weeks. I didn't know how to. I didn't say anything because I was waiting for you to say it first, because it was yours to say, and because every time I rehearsed saying it myself, it came out wrong." She stared at him. "You knew. The trust account," he said. "The law firm. You think I set those things in motion without knowing what they were for?" She sat with this for a moment. The sound of traffic from the street below the window was very clear in the silence. "You've known for 6 weeks," she said, "that I'm pregnant. And you spent those 6 weeks setting up a trust account and establishing legal arrangements and not calling me." "I called you," he said. She said, "You called once. You didn't leave a message." "I know," he said, because leaving a message, because saying it in a recording felt like the least it deserved. She looked at him across the apartment. She thought about the 6 weeks, all the things she had done alone in those 6 weeks, all the decisions she had organized by herself in the disciplined way of someone who was accustomed to not being helped. And she thought about the man across from her spending those same 6 weeks doing something for her that he had not asked her permission to do. And she thought that they were, in fact, very similar in the worst possible way. "We're both terrible at this," she said. He looked at her with something that was almost not management. Something that was almost the Darian she saw in the North Shore house on Sunday mornings, when the professional requirements of his life had not yet arrived with the week. "Yes," he said, "we're very bad at this." She exhaled. It was not a laugh, but it was adjacent to one, which was the closest either of them had gotten to anything light in the last hour. And she thought that adjacent to a laugh was better than nothing. "Tell me the rest," she said. "The part you're still managing," he told her. The Rhine Alliance had been formally announced to both families 8 months ago, while he and Celeste were in the middle of the 8 months that she had been calling, privately. The only 8 months that had mattered so far. He had known the announcement was coming. He had not known how to end what he and Celeste had, because ending it would have required a conversation that would have required explanation that would have required giving her information he was not yet in a position to give, about a world that she was not yet inside, and about consequences that were not hypothetical in the way that consequences were for most people, but were very concrete and had real teeth. The Voss-Rhine arrangement was not sentiment. It was the resolution of a territorial dispute over distribution infrastructure in the northeastern corridor that had been causing friction between two organizations for 4 years and had come close to something worse twice. The marriage was the agreement. The marriage was the document. Without it, the friction resumed, and friction in their world did not stay friction forever. He told her this plainly, without the softening that she had heard him apply to difficult information before, and she received it plainly, which was the only way she had ever been able to receive things from him that were real. She was an architect. She understood the concept of a structure that had to exist because of what it was bearing. She did not like it. Understanding a thing and liking it were two different load calculations, and she had never confused them. So the marriage is the peace treaty, she said. Effectively, he said, and you're the signatory, along with Isadora. She said the name evenly. He looked at her. You've been carrying this since March, she said. Not this specific version of it, but the weight of it. He looked at the window. I've been carrying the weight of it since I was 17, he said, without self-pity, just as a fact. This specific iteration became clear in March. She thought about March. She thought about the hotel room in March, the particular warmth of those hours, the specific feeling of lying in the dark afterward, in the way you lay in the dark when you were in the presence of something that mattered, and you had not yet learned to be frightened of how much. She had felt it then. She wondered if he had, and whether that was the moment it had become something he could not manage cleanly. She did not ask. There were still things she was keeping for later. The baby, she said. He turned from the window. What about the baby? Where does the baby fit into the weight of this? He was quiet, for a beat that was 3 seconds longer than his usual quiet. And in those 3 seconds, she watched something move through his expression that she had not seen in 11 months. Something older than the management and the precision and the suit. Something that had the quality of feeling as opposed to the quality of thought. And he said, the baby is the only thing in this situation that is unambiguously mine. She stared at him. He said, I don't mean that as a claim. I mean it as a fact about what I want. Whatever else is complicated. The baby is not complicated. I know what I want. In relation to the baby. I'm not confused about that. She sat with this for a long moment. What do you want? She said. He looked at her with the specific quality of a man who has said something true and is not going to retreat from it. To be a father, he said, to this child, properly, not as a trust account in a law firm, as a person who shows up. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the trust account, and about the Tribune column, and about the attorney who had called her in the conference room. And she thought about the 6 weeks he had known and had arranged things from a distance instead of picking up the phone. And she thought that the man across from her was, in the specific dimension of emotional directness, a building that had excellent structural integrity and almost no windows, and that she had spent 11 months finding the windows one at a time, and that what he had just said was a window she had not found yet and was larger than she expected. Okay, she said. It was not forgiveness. It was not agreement. It was the specific acknowledgement of information received and not yet fully processed. And he understood that, which was one of the things about him that she would not be able to explain to anyone who had not spent 11 months learning his language. Okay, he said back. They ordered food that evening. Celeste finally admitted she hadn't eaten since the night before, and he did not say, "I told you so," which was its own form of grace. And they ate at the kitchen island and talked about things that were not the arrangement and not the baby. Things that were the ordinary substance of two people who had been in each other's lives for close to a year and had accumulated the kind of shared knowledge that is indistinguishable from intimacy. He told her about the Harborview project. She had mentioned it once in passing, and he had retained the name and had looked up the building, which was typical of him and which she no longer found surprising. She told him about Nina's reaction to the Chicago trip, which made him look at the counter with the expression he used when he was suppressing something that was almost a smile. "Your sister doesn't like me," he said. "My sister has never met you," Celeste said. "She has formed opinions from available data." "Same thing," he said, and this time the almost smile arrived, briefly, in the left corner of his mouth. And she thought that she had missed that specifically, and that missing specific things about a person was always the evidence that the person had been real to you. They cleaned up together in the way they had cleaned up together on Sunday mornings at the North Shore house, divided without discussion, each taking the half that was theirs, and she thought that this was the kind of knowledge that got into a relationship before you meant it to, and then was impossible to remove because it had become structural. She did not say this. She thought about saying it. She was choosing what to say and what to let be said through action, and this felt like the right choice for tonight. She woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of his phone, which he answered in the hallway in the low, precise voice he used for calls that could not be postponed. She lay in the bedroom. They had arrived at a sleeping arrangement without negotiating it, which was either a comfort or a problem. She had not decided, and she listened to the cadence without hearing the words, and she thought about the organization he was heir to, and the arrangement he was bound by, and the phone calls that came at 2 a.m. that he answered without apparent surprise. She had always known this was the landscape of his life. She had been permitted to know it from a comfortable distance. She was lying in the 8th-floor apartment, listening to it now from inside the perimeter, which was a different kind of knowing. He came back after 20 minutes and sat on the edge of the bed and did not immediately lie down, and she said, without pretending to still be asleep, "What was that?" he said. "Nothing you need to worry about tonight," she said. "Darian." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Isadora knows you're here." The specific cold of that information settled through her like a change in atmospheric pressure. How, he said. "Someone in the lobby. She has people in a lot of lobbies." Celeste sat up. She looked at him in the dark of the room, and she thought about a woman she had never met, who was going to marry the man sitting on the edge of this bed, who had people in lobbies, and who had just been informed of Celeste's presence in a city she was not supposed to be in. "What does that mean?" she said. "For tonight." "Nothing," he said. "She won't move without information she doesn't have yet." "And what information is that?" He turned and looked at her in the dark, and what she could see of. His expression was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him yet. Not the absence of management, but something older than management. Something that had been there before. He learned to manage, and that occasionally surfaced when the management was overloaded. "Whether I'm going to go through with it," he said. She sat with this. "Are you?" he said. "That's not something I can answer tonight." She lay back down. He lay down beside her. Neither of them slept quickly. She lay in the dark and thought about a lobby and a phone call at 2 a.m, and a woman she did not know, who had people in a lot of places. And she thought about the shape of the next day and the day after. And she thought that the 2 days she had agreed to were going to be very different from what she had imagined on the plane from Boston, and she was not sure that was wrong. In the morning he made coffee in the way he had made coffee at the North Shore house, strong, Precisi. The kind of attention applied to small things that indicated a person took pleasure in them, and she stood at the river window with the cup, and she thought about pleasure as a category that she had watched him permit himself in increments, coffee, and specific books, and the particular quality of attention he gave to buildings when she described them, as if pleasure was something that had to be rationed against the requirements of everything else. She thought about what it meant to live that way for 17 years. She thought about it without sympathy, because she had been taught by architecture that sympathy was distinct from understanding, and that conflating them led to structural errors. She understood it. She did not pity it. She thought it was something she might be able to love, in the specific way that you could love a building that had been designed to withstand more than you expected it, to withstand with respect for the load it was bearing, rather than with the wish that the load were different. She turned from the window. "Tell me about Isadora," she said. He was at the counter with his own coffee, and he looked at her with the calibration of someone being asked to describe a variable they had been avoiding naming. "What do you want to know? What she's like," Celeste said. "Not what she does. What she's like." He considered. "Precisi," he said. "Strategic. She comes from a family that has been in this world for 3 generations, and she operates with the comfort of someone who knows the landscape completely. She's not warm. She's not unkind. She's thorough." Celeste listened to the description and heard what it didn't contain. "You don't love her," she said. He said, "No." He said it with the cleanness of something that was simply true, rather than something that required statement. "Does she love you?" "No," he said again. "She wants the alliance. I am the vehicle of it. I think she understands that I am in the same position with regard to her." Celeste looked at her coffee. "That's a very frank arrangement," she said. "It's the only honest thing about it," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite bitterness. Bitterness would have implied that he had expected something different, but was the tired cousin of it. The quality of a man who has lived with a necessary thing long enough to have stopped being surprised by how much he dislikes it. She set down her coffee and crossed to where he was standing, and she put her hand on the counter beside his, and she said, "I'm going back to Boston tomorrow morning," he said. "I know. I'm not leaving," she said. "I'm going back to my work and my apartment and my life, which are the things I have built, and which are not going to change because I flew to Chicago for the weekend." He looked at her. "What does that mean for?" "It means," she said, "that I'm not going to disappear, that I'm not going to make this easy for anyone by making myself small and vanishing, and it means that when you figure out whatever you're trying to figure out, you know where I am." He looked at her hand on the counter beside his. He looked at it for a long time. Then he covered it with his, and the touch was not declarative, not a claim or a promise, just the specific warmth of a person, acknowledging the specific fact of another person, which was, she thought, the most honest thing either of them had done in months. She did not move her hand. He did not move his. She was packing that evening, the packing that a person did when they had said what they came to say, and had no reason to delay it into theater, and she was in the bedroom when she heard a sound from the hallway outside the apartment door. Not a knock, a specific sound, like someone stepping and then stopping, in the careful way of a person who has come to confirm something and not yet decided whether to announce themselves. She looked at Darian. He was already moving to the door, not urgently, but with the specific quality of readiness that was always present in him, but usually kept very quiet. And he opened the door and looked into the hallway, and she watched his expression do the thing it did when something he had calculated was arriving ahead of schedule. She came to stand in the hallway behind him and looked past his shoulder, a man she had never seen in a dark suit. The kind that was about function rather than display was in the hallway near the elevator, and he looked at Darian with the specific expression of someone delivering a message, and he said, quietly, "She knows about the account. She's asking for a meeting." Darian said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Tomorrow morning." The man nodded and went back to the elevator. Darian closed the door and turned around. Celeste was standing in the hallway with her half-packed bag behind her, and she said, "Isadora?" He said, "Yes." She said, "She knows about the trust account." He said, "She has people at the law firm." Celeste received that. She thought about a woman who had people at law firms the way other people had colleagues, who knew within 48 hours what was in an account established by a client who had paid specifically for anonymity, who had sent a man to a hallway at 8 in the evening to request a morning meeting. She thought about all the things she had not understood about the landscape she had been adjacent to for 11 months. And she thought that adjacent was a very different position from inside, and that she was currently inside, at least for tonight. She went back to the bedroom and finished packing. She had a morning flight. She was going to take it. That night, before she slept, she lay in the dark of the river apartment, and she felt him put his hand on her abdomen. She had not been awake, not fully, and she was not sure if he knew she could feel it. It was very light, the specific lightness of a touch that was not intended to wake, only to contact. She lay very still. He did not say anything. She did not say anything. The hand stayed for a moment that was long enough to be real, and not so long as to require acknowledgement. And then it was gone. And she lay in the dark with the memory of it pressing into her chest, like a load she had not accounted for in the structural plan. The kind of load that did not break a building, but that changed every calculation you had made about what it could carry. She closed her eyes. She thought that was the most honest thing you've done in 11 months. She thought, and you thought I was asleep. She thought I don't know what to do with the gap between who you are when you think no one is watching and who you are when you know they are. She thought, but I know the gap is there, and that's more than I had 3 days ago. She fell asleep before she found the word for what the gap meant. And she woke to her alarm at 5:30 and dressed in the dark and called a cab and left before he was up. And she left a note on the kitchen counter. 3 words. The same 3 he had sent her. "I'll call you." And she took the cab to O'Hare, and she sat at the gate for the 7 a.m. flight to Boston. And she did not cry, because she had already cried. Privately, in the weeks before Boston. And what she felt now was different from that. Not grief, exactly, but the particular tension of a structure mid-construction. The feeling of load being distributed through a framework that was still being built, and that you had to trust would hold before you had proof that it would. She looked at her phone. She had a text from Darian, sent at 5:41. "The car is outside." She had already taken a cab. She texted back, "I know. I saw it." He wrote, "I know you did." She smiled at the phone. She put it away. The flight boarded. She went home. The 6 weeks that followed were the most organized of her life, which was saying something because Celeste Harmon had always organized well. It was the skill that had gotten her through architecture school and into a firm that was better than her class ranking technically warranted, and through several projects that had required more structural problem solving than the clients had understood they were asking for. But this organizing was different. This was the organizing of a person building a parallel infrastructure to the one that already existed, building it in the spaces between meetings and between meals and between the morning nausea that was beginning to ease and the evening tiredness that was not. She found a pediatrician. She found a larger apartment in Cambridge with a 2nd bedroom, which she could technically afford if she took the Harborview project lead, with the full billing structure she had proposed to Priya. And Priya had approved it the week after her return from Chicago. She researched the logistics of shared custody arrangements for parents who lived in different cities and had different demands on their time and who had not yet articulated to each other or to anyone else what their arrangement was going to be. She built the framework before it was needed, the way you placed rebar before you poured concrete, so the structure had something to reinforce it when the weight arrived. Darian called every 3 days, not every day, which would have felt like surveillance, and not weekly, which would have felt like maintenance. Every 3 days, which felt like something he had considered and chosen, and which she received as evidence of the same kind of deliberate attention he gave to everything that mattered to him. The calls were not long. They covered practical things, the trust account, which she had eventually allowed him to explain in full, a legal framework that his attorney had drafted and hers had reviewed, the anatomy scan, which she told him about on the phone 3 days after, describing the image on the screen in the specific language of someone who had been looking at structural drawings long enough to see architecture in everything. And he had listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and at the end he had said, "What did it look like?" And she had said, "Like a person in miniature." Very certain about taking up space, and he had been quiet for a moment. And then he said, "Good," and she thought she heard something in the word that was not the management. She did not push it. She let it land and moved on, because she was learning. In these 3-day calls, the architecture of what he could give in a phone call versus what required him to be in the same room. And she was beginning to understand that the latter was where most of what was real lived. In the 5th week after Chicago, a woman she had never seen before sat down across from her at the cafe on the ground floor of her building, not at the table Celeste was at, but at the adjacent one, and not in the way of coincidence. The woman was in her early 40s, dark-suited, with the quality of someone who had been in professional settings long enough to become invisible in them. And she said, without preamble, and in a voice pitched low enough for only Celeste to hear, "Miss Harmon, I've been asked to tell you that the building on Clarendon Street is available, the 2nd floor unit. 3 weeks from now if you'd like to make arrangements." Celeste looked at her. "Who asked you to tell me that?" The woman said a name Celeste didn't recognize, not Isadora, not anyone she associated with the Rhine family. A neutral name that belonged to neither side of the landscape she was navigating. "What's on Clarendon Street?" Celeste said. The woman produced a card and placed it on the table. An address, a date, a time, a meeting, the woman said, with someone who has information she thinks you need before you make any permanent decisions about the arrangement you've been constructing. Then she stood up and left, and Celeste sat at the table with the card in her hand and the ginger tea cooling in front of her and thought about the word arrangement, which was both what Darian was engaged in with the Rhine family and what she was building in Cambridge. And she thought about the fact that someone she did not know had used it to describe both things in the same breath, and that this someone had people at law firms and in lobbies, and apparently in the ground floor cafes of Boston office buildings, and that the card on the table was either the most important thing she had been given in 6 weeks or a very precise trap, and she had no way to tell from the outside which one it was. She called Darian. He answered on the first ring, which was different from every previous call. "I know about the card," he said. Before she could speak, how she said, "The same way she knew where you get your tea." He said, "Don't go to the address." She looked at the card. "What is it?" "It's a test." He said, "She's testing whether you'll meet with her independently. If you do, she has information that reframes everything. If you don't," she concludes, "you're not a threat, and moves forward with the assumption that you're manageable. Celeste said, "What information?" He was quiet for a moment. She knows about the account. She knows about the legal framework. She knows about the baby. He paused. She's known about the baby for 4 weeks longer than I have. Celeste sat with that. She's been watching me. She's been watching both of us. He said, "Don't go to the meeting, Darian," she said. He said, "Please." The please was the most undefended word she had heard from him since I couldn't not be here. And she thought that "I'll think about it" was the honest answer, and "I won't" was the answer he needed to hear. And she decided not to perform the easier version. "I need to think about it," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. "All right," he said, finally. "But tell me before you decide." "Yes," she said. She hung up and looked at the card for a long moment, and then she put it in her bag, and she went back upstairs, and she stood at her drafting screen, and she thought about what it meant to have a plan and have someone else's information inserted into it like a variable you hadn't accounted for. And she thought about load-bearing elements, and what happened when one of them turned out to be something other than what you had calculated it to be. She thought about Clarendon Street. She thought about the meeting. She did not go. But for 3 days, she came close. The contract arrived from the new Chicago client on a Monday morning in January, when Celeste was 16 weeks along and had entered the specific phase of pregnancy where the morning sickness was retreating and the energy had returned, and everything felt, physically, more possible than it had in a long time, which was, she thought, the body's method of making sure you didn't change your mind. The client was a development firm she had never worked with before, and the project they were proposing was exactly the kind of work she had been trying to grow into a mixed-use adaptive reuse in the West Loop, a former printing facility from the early 20th century, the kind of bones that required real structural imagination rather than the cosmetic renovation that most developers wanted when they said adaptive reuse. The project scope was appropriate for her firm's size. The fee structure was fair. The timeline required that she spend 2 weeks in Chicago in late January for the initial site work and client meetings. She read the contract 3 times and called her firm's director, Marcus, who confirmed that her firm had received the introductory materials 6 weeks ago from someone at the development company. A referral through a mutual contact in the Chicago architectural community. She accepted. She did not tell Darian. She had decided she was going to be in Chicago before she told him, because telling him first would turn it into a conversation about logistics and safety and the arrangement of things she had not asked to have arranged. And she was not interested in having that conversation in advance when she could have it in person, where he could not retreat to the management. She told him the night before she flew. In a text, "I'm coming to Chicago tomorrow. Site visit for a new project. I'll be there 2 weeks." He called immediately. "What project?" She told him the development firm's name. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, in the precise tone he used when he had information she didn't and was deciding how much to give her at once. "When did you receive the contract?" she told him. He said, "The development firm is a holding company. I don't know who's behind it." She said, "You don't know, or you haven't been able to confirm it yet." A pause. "The second one," he said. "Celeste, I'm coming tomorrow." She said, "It's a real project. It's a real building. I looked up the site, and the permits are genuine, and the preliminary drawings they sent me are good." "I know," he said. "That doesn't Darian." She said, "I am not going to stop working because someone arranged for me to work in Chicago. I'm going to take the job and do it well. And if someone is trying to get me to a specific geography for a specific reason, the best position for me is to be in that geography, knowing more than they expect me to know." There was a long pause. "You've thought about this," he said. "I've thought about everything," she said. "I'm 17 weeks pregnant, and I'm managing a major project, and I've been building a legal framework for co-parenting with a man who is engaged to another woman for the purpose of preventing a war. I think about everything." She heard something from his end of the line that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same building as one, occupying a different floor. "All right," he said. "Where are you staying?" she told him, because she knew him well enough to know that the asking was not surveillance. It was the specific anxiety of someone who was responsible for something and had no protocol for the responsibility. "I'll be fine," she said. "I know you will," he said. "I'll know it better if I know the address." She gave him the address. He said, "I'll see you when you're here." She said, "You'll see me when you call first." He said, "Fair enough." And that was how they left it. She arrived in Chicago on a Tuesday in late January and checked into the hotel she had booked herself, which was in the West Loop near the site. And she went directly to the building on her first afternoon, a 5-story brick structure on a corner, the bones solid under the grime and the decades of institutional use. The windows original and enormous in the way of early industrial architecture that had not yet learned to be stingy with light. She walked the perimeter, and then she got the keys from the development firm's representative, a pleasant, efficient man named Todd, who knew the building's history and the permit timeline and nothing, apparently, about who owned the company he worked for, and she walked every floor alone for 2 hours, making notes and taking photographs and doing the specific, private assessment she always did before anyone else's opinions entered the room. The building was good. The bones were very good. There was a structural problem on the 3rd floor, where a previous renovation had removed a load-bearing wall without adequate replacement support. But it was solvable, and the solution was interesting. And she stood in the 3rd floor space for 20 minutes, working through it in the way she worked through structural problems spatially, physically, letting the geometry of the problem become something she moved through, rather than something she looked at on paper. She left the building at 5:30, feeling the specific satisfaction of good work beginning. And she was on the sidewalk texting Marcus about the 3rd floor issue when her phone rang with Darian's number. She answered. "Are you done at the site?" he said. "Just left," she said. "The building is excellent. I want to take you through it." A pause. When you have an afternoon free," she said. "I'll find an afternoon," he said. And she thought that he would. And she thought that the image of Dominic Voss walking a 19th century printing facility in the West Loop while she explained adaptive reuse structural logic to him was simultaneously unlikely and something she found she genuinely wanted. "Come to dinner tonight," he said. She said, "At the house," he said. "No, somewhere else. Neutral." She thought about neutral. "All right," she said. 7. He named a restaurant in the River North neighborhood, small and specific in the way of places chosen for privacy. And she agreed and went back to the hotel to change. And she stood in the hotel bathroom, looking at herself, in the mirror, the specific shape of herself at 17 weeks. The body that had begun to make its own decisions about what was visible, and she thought that the dinner was neutral in the sense of location and not neutral in any other sense. And she was all right with that. The restaurant was small and warm, and they arrived within 2 minutes of each other, which she thought was either coincidence or the kind of attention to timing that he practiced in everything. And they sat across from each other at a corner table, and they talked. Not about the arrangement, not about the baby, not about the development firm or the holding company or the Clarendon Street card that was still in her bag because she had not thrown it away. which was its own kind of information about her. They talked about the West Loop building and about a project he had seen her write about in a trade publication once that he had read and remembered, and about Boston in winter, and about a trip he had taken to Porto the previous spring that had involved a building she recognized from the photographs on a particular architecture blog she followed. She had not known he read architecture blogs. She had not known a great many specific things about what he read or where he went when the requirements of the life that was his by birth allowed him enough space to go somewhere that was his by choice. And she was learning them tonight across a restaurant table in River North. And she was aware that she was learning them at the same moment, that she was also becoming more visibly pregnant, and that both of these things were happening in the same body, at the same table, in the same city, as the engagement announcement and the trust account, and the hand on her abdomen in the dark, and that the sum of all of it was something she did not have a word for, and might not for some time. He looked at her across the table at some point in the second hour, and said, "You're doing the thing where you're somewhere else in your head." She said, "I'm always somewhere in my head." He said, "Somewhere different. You're calculating something." She looked at him. "The load," she said. "On what?" She looked at the table and then at him. "On this," she said. "On whatever this is. I keep doing the structural math, and it comes out to more than I know how to verify yet." He was quiet for a moment. "Does it come out to more or to enough?" he said. And it was a question she had not expected, and that landed with the specific weight of questions that arrive from the right angle. She looked at him for a long time. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I'm still doing the math." He looked at her with the window quality, the expression that was not management. That was the thing underneath management, that she had been learning to see for 11 months. "That's enough," he said. "For now." She was in the hotel elevator at 10:30 when her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. "The engagement dinner is Thursday at the Waldorf Astoria, 21st floor, 7 p.m. You should know this. No signature. No other information." She stood in the elevator with the phone in her hand and thought about the woman in the cafe with the card and the people in lobbies and the holding company that owned the development firm. And she thought about the specific topology of information in a world where everyone watched everyone, and the question was not whether you were being watched, but whether you understood what the watching was for. She texted Darian, "Someone just told me about the Thursday event at the Waldorf." He replied in 40 seconds, "I know. I was going to tell you." She wrote back, "When?" He did not reply immediately, and the elevator door opened on her floor, and she stood in the hall and waited, and his reply came after a minute. Tonight felt too good to end with that conversation. She stood in the hallway with the phone, and she thought that was either the most human thing he had ever said to her or a very sophisticated way to delay a difficult piece of logistics. And she thought it was probably both. And she went to her room and lay on the hotel bed in the dark and thought about Thursday and the Waldorf Astoria and the 21st floor and whether she was going to do what she was already beginning to understand she was going to do. She had a client meeting Wednesday morning that went long, into the early afternoon, and she was reviewing drawings with Todd in the West Loop building's second floor when the elevator, the original freight elevator, preserved and functional, opened and Darian stepped out. She had not told him where the meeting was. She looked at him. He looked at her. Todd looked between them with the professional readiness of a man who was accustomed to unexpected arrivals in his workday. And Darian said, "I was in the neighborhood," which was not true, and which he did not expect her to believe. She said, "Todd, can you give us 20 minutes, Todd?" To his credit, went immediately to the stairwell and closed the door behind him, and she stood in the second floor space of the West Loop building and looked at Darian in his coat with the January cold still on him, and she said, "You could have called. I wanted to see the building," he said. She looked at him. "Come up to the 3rd floor," she said. "There's a problem I want to show you." They took the freight elevator to the 3rd floor, and she showed him the load-bearing wall issue, and she explained the solution she was developing. And he listened with the attention he gave to things she said about buildings, genuine, specific, without performing interest. And when she finished, he said, "The solution is more elegant than the original." She looked at him. "That's usually the goal," she said. He looked at the space they were standing in, the century-old brick, and the original windows and the floor that had spent 100 years being walked on for industrial purposes and was about to be repurposed for something the original builders could not have imagined. "What do you think it becomes?" he said. She told him the plans she was beginning to develop, the mixed-use logic, the way the light would move through the space at different hours. He listened to all of it and said nothing for a moment after she finished. And then, he said, "You love this," not as a question, as the acknowledgement of something observed. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "I do," he said. "I know. I just wanted to say it out loud." She looked at him, standing in the 3rd floor of her project, with the winter light coming through the enormous original windows, and she thought that this was one of the windows in both senses, and that she was going to remember this specifically. The way you remembered the moments that told you the truth about a situation before you were ready to say the truth out loud. She looked away. "I'm going to the engagement dinner," she said. He went very still. She looked back at him. "I'm going because the client meeting is at the Waldorf, and it ends at 5. And I am going to get into the elevator and go up to my floor, and I am going to pass the 21st floor, and I am going to see whether I choose to stop," he said. "Celeste, I'm not doing it for confrontation," she said. "I'm doing it because I need to understand what I'm in the middle of. You have been managing information for 11 months. I have been operating with partial data. I am 17 weeks pregnant, and I am in a city where someone arranged for me to be here, and I need to understand the full picture." He looked at her for a long time. She could see the war in him between the instinct to manage and the growing understanding that she had watched develop over 11 months, that she was not a variable to be managed. "If she sees you, she already knows about me," Celeste said. "She's known about the baby for 4 weeks longer than you have. The question isn't whether she's going to know I was there. The question is what I see when I'm there." He said nothing for a long moment. The winter light moved through the enormous windows. The freight elevator hummed somewhere below them. "Don't go in," he said. Finally, "Don't go in. Don't be seen. And call me the moment you leave." She looked at him. "That's not a yes," she said. "It's the closest I'm capable of," he said. She held his gaze for a beat. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm accepting it." She went to the client meeting at 4. It ran until 5:15, which meant the engagement dinner on the 21st floor would be in full swing when she reached the elevator bank. She stood at the elevator, and she pressed the up button, and she got in. And she pressed the button for her floor, which was above the 21st. And when the elevator stopped at 21 and the doors opened, she did not step out. She stood in the elevator and looked at the hallway beyond the open doors, the light, the sound of people and music filtering from the ballroom at the far end, the specific opulence of a space designed to make a statement about the people who occupied it, and she was about to press the door close button when a figure came around the corner from the direction of the ballroom and stopped in the hallway and saw her. It was not Darian. It was a woman in a deep green dress, with a kind of presence that arrived before the person did. And she had dark hair and excellent posture, and an expression that Celeste could read from across the elevator lobby because it was the expression of a person who had expected to see her and had prepared for exactly this moment. Isadora Rhine looked at Celeste Harmon through the open elevator doors for exactly 3 seconds before the doors began to close. And in those 3 seconds, she looked at Celeste's face, and then at her abdomen, and then at her face again. And her expression did not change, not shock, not hostility, not the performed softness that Celeste had read in the Tribune photograph. It changed in a different way. A smaller and more precise way. The way a person's expression changed when a calculation they had been running arrived at a number they had anticipated. The doors closed. Celeste pressed her floor. She rode up in the elevator with her heart doing something that was not quite fear and not quite adrenaline, and that had a similar chemical signature to the feeling she got when she was standing on a floor that had a structural problem, and her body was registering the wrongness before her mind had processed it. She texted Darian she saw me. He replied in 20 seconds. "Are you out?" she wrote, in the elevator. He wrote, "Go to your room." "I'll come up," she wrote. "No, I need 20 minutes alone." He was quiet for a moment, and then 20 minutes. She set a timer. She arrived at her floor and went to her room, and she sat in the chair by the window, and she looked at Chicago from the 18th floor at 5:30 in January, and she thought about the 3 seconds, the expression and the calculation that had arrived at a number. She thought about what the number was. She thought about what Isadora had seen a woman she already knew about. In an elevator. At a hotel where Isadora was hosting her engagement dinner. Visibly pregnant, and she thought about what you did with that information if your purpose in this situation was not love, but strategy. She thought for exactly 20 minutes, and at the end of the 20 minutes, she called Darian. He answered before it had finished ringing once. "I'm fine," she said. He exhaled. She thought about the sound of that exhale and put it in the category of things that were real. "She knew I was there," Celeste said. "She was in the hallway. She saw me in the elevator before the doors closed." "I know," he said. "She texted me." Celeste sat with that for a moment. "What did she say?" He said. She said, "Now we need to talk. 3 of us." Celeste looked at Chicago through the hotel window. When she said, he said, she suggested Friday. Celeste looked at the timer on her phone, which had 3 seconds left. "All right," she said, "but not here, not the Waldorf, somewhere I choose." He said, "Whatever you want." She named a coffee shop in the West Loop, 2 blocks from her building site, the one she had been going to every morning for a week, and where the staff knew her order. On her territory, in her neighborhood, on her terms. "Friday at 9, she said. He said, "I'll tell Heir," she said. "And Darian," he said. "Yes," she said. "I want to know about room 14 before Friday, whatever it is. I need to know before I walk into a room with her." The silence on his end was the longest she had heard from him since the conference room in Boston, when she had asked him to start from the real beginning. Then he said, "Come downstairs. I'll be in the lobby in 15 minutes, she said. "I'll meet you in the lobby." She put on her coat. She looked at herself in the mirror for a moment at the woman who had flown to Chicago for a real project and had ended up in a hotel elevator in a building with a structural problem on 3 floors, not just 1. And she thought that the structural problem on the 3rd floor of the West Loop building was the kind that, once you identified it, you could not pretend you hadn't seen. She went downstairs. He was in the lobby when she came out of the elevator, standing at the far end, near the window that looked out onto the street. And he was not on his phone, and he was not looking at the door. He was looking at the street with the specific quality of someone who had been standing there for longer than 15 minutes, which meant he had been on his way before she called. She crossed the lobby to him and stood beside him at the window, and they both looked at Chicago in the January dark. At the cars and the lights and the city doing what it did, regardless of what anyone inside it was navigating, and she said, "Room 14. He turned from the window. "Do you want to sit down?" she said. "No. I want to stand here where it's not a conversation that can be ended by someone walking into a room." He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "All right," he told her. Room 14 was not a room. It was a designation, a term used by the Voss family's legal infrastructure for a specific type of contingency arrangement. The kind of arrangement that was established for people who needed to be protected from consequences they had not chosen and could not be publicly acknowledged as being protected from. His grandfather had created the system 30 years ago for a particular situation. His father had used it twice. Darian had activated it 4 months ago. The Room 14 for Celeste's situation was the full architecture of what she had discovered in pieces: the trust account, the legal framework, the holding company, the development firm's contract. All of it was Room 14. All of it had been constructed to give her a complete, independent, protected life that did not depend on him, or on the outcome of the Voss-Rhine arrangement, or on any decision she had not made herself. With full knowledge and full resources, the trust account was not emergency money. It was a fund substantial enough to support her and the child for the child's entire education, regardless of what Darian's legal obligations were or were not, regardless of whether the co-parenting arrangement held or fell apart or was contested by any party. The development firm contract was a real contract for a real project that had been selected because it was exactly the kind of work she was trying to do, and the referral had been arranged through an actual colleague who had been asked to make an introduction to a development firm that Darian's people had acquired specifically to enable the referral. He had bought a development firm to get her a project she deserved. She stood at the lobby window and let this arrive in her in pieces: the holding company, the legal framework, the trust account, a development firm, an entire system constructed for her, quietly, without her knowledge, by a man who had been taught from the age of 17 that the best protection was the kind that was invisible. "How long did this take to build?" she said. He said, "I started it in October." She looked at him. "Before the column ran. Before the column ran." He said, "When you knew." He said, "When I knew." She said, "You built me an entire parallel infrastructure and you didn't tell me." "No," he said. "Why?" He looked at her with the window expression, the real one, the one without management, and he said, "Because if I told you, you would have refused it. And then, when you needed it, it wouldn't be there." She looked at the street through the glass. She thought about the specific truth of this. She thought about the trust account call she had ended, the cab she had taken instead of the car, the way she had booked her own flight and refused his arrangements and managed everything herself for 6 weeks and 5 months before that. She thought that he knew her, in the specific way that you knew someone when you had paid attention for 11 months. He knew exactly which things she would refuse and why. And he had constructed Room 14 around those refusals the way a structural engineer constructed around the load path. Not fighting the force, but working with it. She said, "That was either the most brilliant or the most arrogant thing anyone has ever done for me." He said, "It was both." She turned and looked at him. He was looking at her with complete directness, with none of the management, and she thought about what it cost him to admit that something he had done was arrogant, because arrogance in his vocabulary was the thing you did when you valued your own judgment above someone else's right to make a choice. And he was naming that clearly, which was different from defending it. "Okay," she said. He said, "Okay," she said. "I'm not forgiving it right now, but I understand it." And understanding it is, she thought about how to finish the sentence. It's the start of a conversation rather than the end of one. He nodded. She looked at the lobby. She thought about Friday morning and the coffee shop in the West Loop and Isadora Rhine's expression through the closing elevator doors. "What does Isadora want?" she said. He said, "I think she wants to understand what she's actually dealing with. She's been operating on incomplete information about your situation and mine. And she's strategic enough to know that incomplete information is a liability." Celeste thought about this. She wants to know whether to adjust her strategy, or whether she has one at all. He said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite hope and was not quite desperation, but was the specific quality of a man who has been waiting for something to become clear enough to act on. She looked at him for a long time. "Go home," she said. "I'll see you Friday." He said, "Will you call me tonight?" she said. "Maybe," he said. "I'll take maybe," she said. "I know you will." She walked back to the elevator and pressed up, and she did not look back. But she heard him not moving until the doors had closed, and she held that the evidence of his staying in the lobby while she left, and she thought about the load it represented and whether she had calculated correctly for it. And she thought that the math was still running, and that it was beginning to come out to something that felt, for the first time in months, like enough. She called him at 11 that night. He answered on the first ring again, which was becoming a pattern she was storing. "I have a question," she said. He said, "Yes," she said. "The development firm. Do you have plans for the building after the project?" he said. "I thought you might want to buy in." "The firm. Not just the project. If the Harborview work goes the way I think it will, you'll want a Chicago presence." It seemed like useful infrastructure. She sat with this for a long moment. She thought about useful infrastructure and what it meant from Dominic Voss, and whether she was going to be angry about it, or whether she was going to recognize it as the particular language of a man who said, "I love you," in load-bearing walls, and trust accounts, and development firms acquired for a purpose. She thought about the building in the West Loop, and the third-floor problem and the solution that was more elegant than the original, and she thought, this is what we are. Two people who solve problems with structure. Two people who build instead of saying, "I would need full ownership." She said, "Of my stake." "Obviously," he said. She said, "And I would need a real business case. Not a gift." "It's not a gift," he said. "It's an investment. The project is going to make both of us money." She looked at the Chicago night from the hotel window. She thought, this is how it starts. Not with declarations. With this, "All right," she said. "We'll talk about it after Friday," he said. "After Friday," she said. "Good night, Darian," he said. "Good night, Celeste." She hung up and lay in the hotel bed in Chicago and thought about Friday morning and the coffee shop, 2 blocks from the West Loop building, and the three of them in a room together for the first time. And she thought that the structural problem on the 3rd floor of her building was more interesting than the one she had come here to solve, and that interesting problems were the ones worth staying for. Friday arrived with the particular quality of days that have been anticipated so specifically that their actual arrival feels both inevitable and slightly unreal. Celeste was at the coffee shop at 8:40, 20 minutes before the meeting, because she was always early to things that mattered, and she wanted to be there before either of them arrived, to be in her own territory first. The coffee shop was on a corner in the West Loop with exposed brick and large windows, and the specific smell of a place that had been there long enough to have become part of the neighborhood rather than imposed on it. She ordered her tea from the barista, who by now knew her name, and she took the corner table that she had been sitting at every morning for a week, and she put her bag on the chair across from her and her coat on the chair beside her, and she sat with both hands around her cup, and she thought about structural problems and the solutions that were more elegant than the original. And she thought that a meeting between a woman who was 17 weeks pregnant with the heir's child and the woman the heir was supposed to marry was not a structural problem that any framework she had ever worked with had a precedent for, and she was going to have to build the solution from first principles. Darian arrived at 8:55. He saw her in the corner, and he came to the table, and he looked at the bag on the chair across from her and took the chair beside her instead, which put the two of them on the same side of the table facing the door. She looked at him. He looked at the position of her bag. Neither of them said anything about it, which was itself a form of communication that she thought they were becoming increasingly fluent in. He ordered a coffee, and he sat with it, and they both watched the door, and at 9:02 Isadora Rhine walked in. She was in a camel coat, and she carried nothing in her hands, and she looked at the two of them at the corner table without apparent surprise, not at the arrangement of them side by side, not at the belly that was more visible now than it had been in the elevator on Thursday, and she crossed to the table with the quality of presence that Celeste had observed through the closing elevator doors. The quality of a woman entirely at home in any room she entered because she had decided to be. She sat down across from them. She looked at Celeste first, then at Darian, then at Celeste again. "Thank you for meeting me," she said. Her voice was what Celeste had expected from the description, precise, controlled. The voice of someone who had been speaking in professional registers for so long that it had become her default register. "Thank you for the advance notice," Celeste said, and she said it without edge, as a statement of fact, and she watched Isadora receive it with the small recalibration of someone who had prepared for hostility and encountered something different. The elevator was not planned, Isadora said. "I know," Celeste said. "You looked like someone who had prepared for it anyway." Pause. The ghost of something crossed Isadora's face that Celeste could not fully read, but that had the quality of recognition, one precise person recognizing another. "I've been preparing for a great many things," Isadora said. "Since the second month." Celeste looked at her. Darian, beside her, was very still. "Tell me what you want from this meeting," Celeste said. Isadora looked at her for a long moment, and then she said, "The same thing you do. I suspect. Accurate information." Celeste looked at her. "Go ahead," she said. Isadora talked. What Isadora had to say took 40 minutes. 2 coffees on her end, and 3 separate moments where Celeste had to actively choose not to look at Darian, because she suspected that if she did, she would lose the thread of what Isadora was saying. The substance was this: Isadora Rhine had been aware of the Voss-Rhine arrangement since she was 26. She had entered it with her eyes open and her expectations calibrated to what it was. A business arrangement with a structural purpose and a personal cost that she had decided she could manage. She had not been under any illusion that Darian was in love with her. She was not in love with him. She had told her father, when the arrangement became formal, that she expected it to be precisely what it was: a legal union in service of a territorial agreement, and her father had told her that was the most practical thing she had ever said, which was the specific kind of endorsement that the Rhine family offered its daughters and that Isadora had long since accepted as the available vocabulary. She had been managing this for 8 years. She had built a life that existed alongside the expectation rather than in spite of it. She was not, she said, a victim of the arrangement. She was an executor of it. The difference mattered to her. What she had not accounted for was Room 14. She had known about Room 14. In the abstract sense, her father had mentioned its existence as a Voss family mechanism years ago, in the context of the arrangement's longevity, but she had not known it had been activated until 6 weeks after the trust account was established. When one of her father's people had come across the law firm's name in a transaction record and cross-referenced it, from that point, she had been watching. She had watched Celeste Harmon in Boston. She had watched Darian's 3-day calls. She had watched the anatomy scan appointment in the calendar of the OB's office, which was a piece of surveillance that Celeste received with the specific chill of understanding that the perimeter of her private life was a great deal more permeable than she had arranged for it to be, and that she needed to address this regardless of what else happened today. And what Isadora had concluded from 6 weeks of watching was not what Celeste had expected her to conclude. "He's not going to go through with it," Isadora said. She said it to Celeste, not to Darian, as if Darian were not at the table. Celeste looked at her. Darian did not move. "He's been systematically building a case for the dissolution of the arrangement," Isadora said. "Room 14 is not a protection mechanism for a parallel situation. It's the infrastructure for an exit. He's been constructing the documentation for an exit from this arrangement for 4 months, long enough that the exit, if executed correctly, could be framed as a breach originating from the Rhine side, rather than from a personal decision by Darian, which would mean the territorial dispute that the arrangement was designed to resolve would fall on our family to manage, rather than his." She paused. She looked at Darian for the first time since she had sat down, "which is an extraordinarily sophisticated exit strategy," she said. "And I would like to know what breach you've manufactured, because I have been trying to identify it for 6 weeks, and I have not been able to find it." Celeste turned and looked at Darian. He was looking at Isadora with the contained expression she recognized as the one he wore when a variable had arrived ahead of schedule and he was performing the rapid recalculation. He said, "You knew," Isadora said. "I knew the shape of it. I didn't know the documentation." He said, "I found it in November," Isadora said. "Found what?" He looked at her for a moment, and then he reached into his coat the inside pocket. The specific pocket where Celeste had seen him keep things that mattered, and he produced a folded document and set it on the table between them. Celeste looked at the document. It was a transaction record, dense with numbers and account references, and at the top was a company name. She recognized Rivera Logistics and Holdings. She had heard that name somewhere, distantly, in a context she could not immediately place. She looked at Darian. He said, "In October, when I activated Room 14, I also began the formal audit of the territorial infrastructure that the Voss-Rhine arrangement was designed to protect." Isadora was looking at the document with an expression that was, for the first time in the meeting, not controlled. It was the expression of someone receiving information that was arriving on a vector they had not anticipated. "The Eastern Corridor distribution infrastructure," Darian said, "that the arrangement was designed to jointly manage. It's been running at a deficit for 14 months. Not a natural deficit, a manufactured one. The cash that should have been in the infrastructure accounts has been moving through a series of holding companies, 6 of them. And it arrives eventually in a fund that is managed by a company called Rivera Logistics." He looked at Isadora, "which is owned, through 3 layers of incorporation, by your father." The silence at the corner table had a physical quality. Celeste felt it against her skin. Isadora looked at the transaction record, and she looked at it with the expression of a person who had been operating under a set of assumptions that had just been structurally invalidated. And Celeste watched her process it In real time, the recalculation, the implications, the new load distribution, and she thought that she was watching someone who was intelligent enough to understand what they were looking at, and brave enough not to perform not understanding. He's been extracting from the joint infrastructure, Isadora said. Not a question. Since before the formal announcement of the arrangement, Darian said. The arrangement wasn't designed to protect the territorial infrastructure. It was designed to give your father's people access to the Voss side of the infrastructure while the extraction continued. You are a signatory, he said, and his voice was not accusatory, it was specific, careful, the tone of a man delivering information he is not enjoying. To several of the holding company documents, whether your signature was given with full knowledge is something I cannot determine from the documents alone. Isadora looked at the transaction record for a long moment. She said, quietly, I sign what my father puts in front of me. She said it with the specific flatness of someone acknowledging a pattern that they had participated in without fully examining. And Celeste heard it with the particular weight of recognizing a familiar architecture, the architecture of doing what was expected and calling it competence. I know, Darian said. I don't believe you knew what the documents were for. I didn't, she said. She looked up from the document. She looked at Darian. You have the exit, she said. The breach you needed. My father's extraction is the breach. Yes, he said. You can dissolve the arrangement on the grounds that the Rhine side was operating in bad faith from the beginning. The liability for the territorial dispute falls on the Rhine family, where it belongs. Since your father was the one who manufactured the dispute in the first place by draining the infrastructure that the arrangement was supposedly protecting. Isadora was quiet for a long time. The coffee shop moved around them, people ordering, the barista calling names, the specific warm noise of a West Loop morning, and the three of them sat in the corner with the transaction record between them and the fines. Enormous consequence of it sitting in the air, Isadora said. What do you want from me? Darian said. Your cooperation. You testify to the signing pattern what you signed. When, with what instruction from your father, your testimony closes the breach without it being contested. The arrangement dissolves without a war, because the fault line is your father's malfeasance, not a personal choice on my part. Isadora looked at the table. Celeste was watching her and thinking about what it cost to understand that your father had used you as a vehicle for something you had not been told about, and about what it cost to then be asked to testify to it, and about what particular architecture of strength that required. My father will not. Isadora started. I know, Darian said. I have people who will make sure he is managed before the testimony. He won't have the ability to respond the way he otherwise would. Isadora looked at him. Then she looked at Celeste. She said, to Celeste, he built all of this to protect you. Celeste looked at her. And to protect you, she said, you're in those documents too. Isadora received this. She looked at the table and she looked at the transaction record and she said, I need 48 hours. Darian said, you have them. Isadora stood. She put on her coat and she picked up her bag and she looked at the two of them one more time. And there was something in the way she looked at them, at the arrangement of them side by side, that was the closest to honest that a person in her position could be. A kind of recognition that was not warm exactly, but was not cold either. More like the acknowledgement of a thing that was real, regardless of its convenience. She said, take care of her. Darian said, I intend to. She left. The coffee shop filled back in around the space she had occupied, and Celeste sat in the corner table with Darian beside her, and the transaction record still on the table between them. and she thought about 4 months of construction, the trust account, the legal framework, the development firm, the holding companies, the audit, the documentation, and she thought about a man who had been taught since he was 17 that the best protection was invisible, who had spent 4 months building an invisible architecture for her, while simultaneously building a case to free himself from the arrangement that had been in place since he was 25. And she thought about how long that had been running in parallel with the 11 months she had known about, and how much of what she had interpreted as management was in fact something more complicated and more costly. She said, "You've been working on this since October, since the day after you told me about the test," he said. She turned and looked at him. He was looking at the table. "The day after," she said. "Yes, you found out about the baby, and the next day you started building a case to dissolve a 9-year arrangement," he said. "I had been looking for the right case for 4 months before that. October gave me the reason to move faster." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "You should have told me," he said. "I know," she said. "Not about the arrangement or the breach or the documents, about what you were trying to do. I needed to know you were trying." He looked at her then, and the expression was the complete, unmanaged version, all of it visible at once. The complexity and the cost and the thing she had spent 11 months learning to see, and that she now saw clearly, which was a man who had been carrying an enormous weight for a very long time and who had decided, in October, that he was not willing to carry it in a direction that did not include her. "I didn't know how to tell you without telling you everything," he said. "And telling you everything meant telling you about a world I wasn't sure you wanted to be inside," she said. "I was already inside it. I just didn't know," he said. "I know. I'm sorry." The sorry arrived without management. Without the diplomatic construction she had heard him apply to difficult information before. Just the word, with the weight it warranted. She said, "I know you are." She looked at the transaction record on the table. She looked at the coffee shop around them. She thought about room 14 and the West Loop building and the development firm and the anatomy scan and the call at 2 in the morning and the hand on her abdomen in the dark of the River North apartment, and the weight of all of it, the entire load of the last 4 months, and she thought about what it weighed and whether she had calculated correctly for it, and she thought that the calculation was still running and that it was coming out to more than she had thought she could carry, and that she was beginning to understand that more than you thought you could carry was sometimes the right amount. "What happens if Isadora says no?" she said. He said, "Then I dissolve it without her cooperation and accept the consequences." She said, "What are the consequences?" he said. "Significant. Manageable. I've modeled them." She looked at him. "You've modeled the consequences of dissolving a 9-year peace arrangement unilaterally." "Yes," he said. And it's survivable," he said. "It costs more and it takes longer, and there's a period of friction that is genuinely dangerous for about 6 months. But it's survivable," she said. "You were going to do it anyway." He said, "Yes," she said. "Even if you hadn't found the breach." He said, "Yes," she said. "Since October," he said. "Yes," she said. "The baby," he said, quietly. "The baby. And you. Both. In that order by one day." She sat with this for a very long time. The coffee shop kept moving around them. A child at the next table was trying to convince her mother to let her have a second muffin, and the negotiation was proceeding in the specific back and forth of people who understood each other's leverage. Celeste watched it for a moment and thought that this was what negotiation looked like when both parties were operating in good faith, when the goal was an outcome that both of them could live with, rather than a win for one at the cost of the other. She looked at Darian. She said, "We need to talk about what happens after. After the arrangement is dissolved. What we actually are," he said. "I know," she said. "Not tonight. Not until after Isadora's 48 hours. He said, "All right," she said. "But after that, we need to have the conversation we haven't had yet. The one about what we want. What you want. Not what you're protecting me from, what you actually want. In the same room. With me in it." He looked at her with the complete expression and he said, "I know what I want." She said, "Then you need to say it out loud." He said, "I know." She picked up her bag. She stood. He stood with her. And for a moment, they were both standing in the corner of the coffee shop, 2 blocks from her building site, with the January light coming through the large windows and the transaction record on the table, and 48 hours between them and the conversation they still needed to have. And she said, "I'm going to the building." He said, "I know." She said, "Come if you want." He said, "I want." She said, "Then come." They left the coffee shop together, and neither of them said anything on the 2-block walk to the building. Because sometimes the most honest thing was the presence itself, the walking, the arriving, the choosing to be somewhere together, and the words came later, which was the thing that Room 14 had been building toward all along. The specific outcome of a man who built in silence 2 people walking together toward a building that was not yet finished. That was going to be exceptional. That was going to hold more than the original had been designed for. She showed him the 3rd floor. She showed him the load-bearing wall that had been removed. And she showed him the ghost of where it had been, the shadow on the floor, the slight depression in the ceiling where the load had been redistributed imperfectly by whoever had done the work 30 years ago. And she showed him the solution she had been developing, which involved a series of steel channels embedded in the flooring that would carry the load laterally to the perimeter walls, invisible from above, structural, without announcing itself. He stood in the space and listened to her explain it, and then he walked the perimeter the way she had taught herself to walk a perimeter slowly, touching the walls at intervals, feeling for the response of a structure that was being asked to do more than it was originally designed for. "The perimeter walls are stronger than the documentation suggests," he said. She looked at him. "They usually are," she said. "The documentation is always conservative," he said, "because the builders didn't want to promise more than they could verify." She said, "Right. But the actual structure often exceeds the documentation because the people who built it understood their materials better than they could write about them." He looked at her from across the 3rd floor space, and she thought about what she had just said, and whether she had meant to apply it to more than the building. And she thought that she had, and that he knew she had, and that this was the specific texture of being known by someone, that they heard what you meant before you had decided to mean it. "The bones are good," he said. She said, "The bones are excellent." He said, "What happens to the 2nd floor?" She told him. He listened to the whole thing, walking slowly along the south wall with his hands in his pockets. And when she finished, he said, "How long will you need to be in Chicago for the site work?" she said. 2 weeks for this visit. Probably another 3 weeks in the spring before construction starts," he said. And after that, she said, "Periodic. Monthly. Probably. Once construction is underway." He nodded. He was looking at the original windows, enormous, the kind that had been put into light industrial work, that made the space feel enormous even at its current empty, unfinished state. "The light is extraordinary," he said. She said, "I know. It's the first thing I saw." He turned from the window. "I want to show you something," he said. He took out his phone and pulled up an image, a photograph of a building. A residential building. Also early industrial. Also in the West Loop. 3 blocks from where they were standing. It's been empty for 6 years, he said. The development firm acquired it in December. She looked at the photograph. She looked at the building. She thought about the bones she could see even in the photograph. The original windows. The corner location. The height. She looked at him. That one is mine, she said. He said, if you want it. She said, that's a 200-unit residential conversion. That's not a small project. He said, no. She looked at the photograph for a long moment. She thought about the drawer full of sketches she had told him about in November, the buildings she had been wanting to do, that she had not had the platform or the resources or the right moment to pursue. She thought about what right moment meant when you were building the platform and the resources at the same time as you were building a life that had not looked like this 18 months ago. She said, I would need full creative control. He said, it's your building, she said, and a proper partnership structure. Not a gift. Not a favor. A business arrangement with a real equity stake. He said, I'll have the attorney draft the terms. She said, your attorney or mine? He said, both. She looked at the photograph one more time. She handed the phone back to him. She said, after the 48 hours, after we've had the conversation we need to have, then we talk about the building. He took the phone. He looked at her. He said, after the 48 hours. She said, yes. She looked out the enormous original windows at the West Loop morning, at the buildings visible from the 3rd floor of a printing facility from the early 20th century, at the city that did not know what was being decided inside this space and did not need to. She thought about structures and what they were built for and what they turned out to be capable of, and she thought that the best buildings always exceeded what the original documentation said they could hold, because the people who built them had understood their materials from the inside out, from the quality of the thing itself, rather than from the record of the thing. And she thought that this was the right way to understand most things that mattered. She was beginning to understand Dominic Voss from the inside out. She was not finished. She had a great deal of building left to do. She thought that was, for the first time in a long time, something she was not afraid of. The 48 hours passed in the way of periods that are being actively waited through slowly in the moment, and then suddenly, at the end, she worked. She was at the building every morning and at her hotel in the evenings, and Darian did not come to the building again during those 2 days, which she understood as the space he was giving her for the wait, and she received it as such. Isadora's call came on Saturday afternoon, while Celeste was standing on the 3rd floor alone with her drawings, doing the specific calculation for the steel channel load path that she had been working through for a week. Isadora asked for Darian first, which was the protocol, and Celeste gave her his number. And then Isadora said, "May I speak to you as well?" Miss Harmon, Celeste said. "Yes," Isadora said. "I've spoken to my attorney, and to my father. Pausa. My father is not willing to acknowledge the extraction voluntarily. He will contest any testimony I give." Another pause. "However, I have my own documentation. I found it this morning. Records of the signature requests he sent me, with annotations in his handwriting explaining what I was signing. He annotated everything. He's meticulous. It was a quality I had always admired, and the annotations are explicit about the purpose of the documents." Celeste was quiet. "You have proof that you signed in ignorance and proof of his intent," she said. "Yes," Isadora said. "I sent copies to my attorney this morning and to Darian's attorney an hour ago," Celeste said. "Isadora." She said it as she would have said it to a colleague who had done something that cost them something, with the specific acknowledgement that the cost was real. What Isadora said. "I'm sorry he put you in this," Celeste said. The pause from Isadora's end was long enough to tell her that the statement had arrived at an angle that Isadora had not prepared for. That she had prepared for negotiation and consequences and legal logistics, and had not prepared for someone to name the cost directly. "Thank you," Isadora said, and her voice was precisely what Celeste expected, controlled, steady. But something in it had shifted, a degree of something that was warmer than Celeste had heard from her. "What happens to you now?" Celeste said. Isadora said, "I have a life. I've been maintaining it in parallel for 8 years. It will be easier to maintain without the weight of this arrangement." She paused. "And my father will have to answer for what he's done, which I find, to my own surprise, that I am not sorry about." Celeste thought about the specific quality of that, the not sorry about a father's consequences. And she thought about all the ways a family could be a load that was being carried in the wrong direction. And she thought about the annotated documents and what kind of daughter found them and sent copies to 2 different attorneys on a Saturday morning and called the woman who was carrying her almost fiancé's child to say she would cooperate. "Thank you," Celeste said. Isadora said, "Good luck with your building." She knew about the building. Of course she did. Celeste almost laughed. And almost laughs were, she was finding, one of the defining qualities of this situation. "Thank you," she said. She hung up. She put her phone in her pocket. She stood on the 3rd floor of the West Loop building in the January Chicago afternoon with the steel channel load path calculation on the table in front of her, and she thought, now we have the conversation. She called Darian from the 3rd floor. Isadora called. He said, "I know. She called me first. I have the documents from her attorney." She said, "Is it enough?" He said, "It's more than enough. My attorney says it dissolves the arrangement on grounds of bad faith with clear attribution to the Rhine family's actions. The territorial dispute becomes the Rhine family's problem to manage, which is exactly where it belongs given that Isadora's father was the one who manufactured it." Celeste stood at the window. She looked out at the West Loop in January. She said, "When does it happen formally?" He said, "Monday. My attorney files Monday morning. It will take several days to process, but the substance is done as of the filing." She said, "And your father," he said, "My father will be informed Sunday evening. I've been waiting for this documentation before having that conversation." She said, "He's going to be angry." He said, "Yes." She said, "And then what?" He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "And then I have the conversation with him that I've been preparing to have for 4 months. I'm going to tell him about you, about the baby, about what I want." She said, "What do you want?" He said, "I've told you what I want." She said, "Tell me again." On the phone, explicitly, he said, "I want to be with you. I want to be a father to our child, properly, not as an arrangement and not as a management exercise. I want to be in the same city as you. I'll come to Boston, or you can come to Chicago, or we find a third thing. But I want proximity, not a 3-day call every 3 days for the rest of my life." She said, "The rest of your life?" He said, "Yes, that's the scope I'm thinking about." She stood at the window for a long moment. She looked at the building across the street, the residential conversion that was going to be her building. She looked at the West Loop in January. She thought about Boston and Chicago, and the architecture of a life built between 2 cities and what that load looked like when it was distributed correctly. She said, "I need to think about the logistics." He said, "Of course you do. she said. Not because I'm uncertain about what I want. Because I'm an architect and I think about how things are built before I commit to building them, he said. I know, she said. I want to be in Chicago for the building. The residential conversion, I need to be here for it. That's real, and that's going to take 2 years at minimum, he said. Boston will still be there, she said. My firm won't wait 2 years, he said. Your firm, or your position in it. She thought about this. She thought about Marcus and the Harborview project, and the way Priya had said, best section you've written, when she had put more of herself in. She thought about what putting more of herself in looked like when the work was hers, and the building was hers, and the city was the one she was choosing rather than the one she had defaulted to. She said, I need to talk to Marcus. He said, Of course, she said, and I need to meet your father before the baby comes. Not as a concession and not as a performance. As the person who is going to be part of your family, whether your father is comfortable with it or not, he said. I'll arrange it, she said. Not you, me. I'll call him and arrange it myself. A pause. He won't expect that, Darian said. She said, Good. I want him to know from the beginning what he's dealing with. She heard, from Darian's end of the line. The thing that was not quite a laugh and not quite a smile, but that existed in the specific frequency between them that she was learning to hear. She thought she was going to be hearing it for a very long time. All right, he said. I'll give you his number, she said. Good. She turned from the window. She looked at the third-floor space of the West Loop building. The brick and the original windows and the steel channel load path calculation on the table. She said, Darian, he said. Yes, she said. The day after you found out about the baby, you started building room 14, he said. Yes, she said. The baby was the reason you moved faster. Not me, he said. The baby was the reason I stopped being patient. You were the reason I had been building the case at all. She received this. She held it the way she held load calculations carefully, with attention to what it actually said, rather than what she wanted it to say. Come to the building tomorrow, she said. In the afternoon. I want to show you the residential conversion from the outside, he said. What time? She said. 3. He said. I'll be there at 3, she said. I know you will. She hung up. She stood in the third floor of the West Loop building, and she thought about what she was building, and she thought about what she had been building for 11 months, and she thought about what she was going to be building next. And she thought that the most honest thing she had ever done in her professional life was admit when a structural problem was more interesting than she had initially planned for, and commit to the solution anyway. The structural problem on this floor was more interesting than she had planned for. She was committed to the solution. It was going to be exceptional. The family meeting was called for the following Sunday, which gave Celeste a week in which she completed 2 major drawings for the West Loop project. Walked the residential conversion building twice from the outside and once from the inside, with Todd's help and a set of original architectural drawings she had requested from the city permit office. Called Marcus in Boston and had a conversation that was professional and direct and resulted in a restructuring of her position at the firm that gave her Chicago project authority without requiring her to resign and reapply, and called Darian's father. His name was Dominic Voss, and he answered the phone himself, which she had not expected, and he said, Miss Harmon, in a voice that had the specific quality of a man who had been told to expect a call and had prepared for it with the seriousness he applied to negotiations, which she received as a form of respect, even if it was not the form she would have preferred. She said, Mr. Voss, I'd like to meet with you before the family meeting on Sunday. I think we should have a conversation before we're in a room with everyone else." He was quiet for a moment. She could hear something in the quality of his quiet that was not hostility and was not warmth. It was the specific quality of someone taking a measure. "Why?" he said. She said, "Because I'm going to be in your family's life for a very long time, and so is my child. And I would like us to have had an honest conversation before we're in the position of performing one for an audience." Another pause. "Longer," he said. "Thursday, 11 in the morning. I'll send an address," she said. "I'll find it myself." "Thank you." She heard something from his end that she thought, if she had to identify it, she would have called the beginning of something that wasn't disapproval. She met him Thursday at an office in the Streeterville neighborhood, his own. A corner room with a view of the lake that was used less for the view than for the specific message a lake view sent about. The person behind the desk, and she sat across from him, and she looked at the man who had sat his son down at 17 to explain the shape of his life. And she thought that Dominic Voss was a man who had built something and was afraid of what happened to it after him. And that fear was a thing she understood, because it was the specific fear of every architect who had ever finished a building and then had to walk away. She said, "I know this is not what you planned for." He said, "No, it's not." She said, "I'm not going to ask you to be comfortable with it. I'm going to ask you to be honest with me about what you need from this situation, and I will be honest with you about what I need. And we'll see if there's a structure that works for both of us." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "You're not what I expected." She said, "I imagine Darian didn't describe me in detail." He said, "He described you as the most structurally honest person he had ever met, which I found difficult to interpret." She said, "That's the most accurate thing he could have said." Dominic Voss looked at her for another long moment, and she held the look, the way she held the look, of a structural problem she was assessing directly, without flinching, with the specific patience of someone who understood that the assessment took as long as it needed to take. He said, "The child will be a Voss, not a question, not a demand, a statement offered for confirmation. The child will be whoever she decides to be," Celeste said, with full knowledge of where she came from, on both sides. He looked at her. She looked back. Something shifted in the quality of his expression, not softening, not quite, but a recalibration, the kind that happened when a person updated their model of a situation based on new data. He said, She said, "We found out last week." He said nothing for a moment. She watched him receive the specific weight of that pronoun, the granddaughter he had not allowed himself to anticipate, because the situation had not been in the plan, and she thought about structures and the loads they bore and whether a person could exceed their original documentation the way buildings did. She thought that they could. She thought she was watching it happen. He said, "Thursday is a good day for a meeting." It was not an answer to anything she had said. She understood it as a statement about the meeting they were having, as a way of saying this was worth the time. She said, "I agree." They talked for another 40 minutes, and when she left, she did not have his approval. She had not asked for it, and he had not offered it, but she had something that was more useful, which was his honesty, and the specific quality of his attention, which told her that he was going to engage with the situation as it was, rather than as he had planned for it to be. And that was the beginning of a workable structure. The family meeting on Sunday was at the North Shore house. Celeste had been to the North Shore house before twice, in the middle of the 11 months, both times on a Sunday, but she had never been to it in the particular capacity of this Sunday, which was a meeting of the Voss family infrastructure and the people it was connected to, assembled for the specific purpose of understanding what the dissolution of the Voss-Rhine arrangement meant and what replaced it. There were 12 people in the main room when she arrived, which was more than she had anticipated. And she stood in the doorway for a moment and did a very fast structural assessment of the room, who was positioned where, who was watching the door when she came in, who was watching Darian, who was watching Edmund. Darian was standing at the far end of the room near the fireplace, and he saw her the moment she came in. He crossed to her immediately, which was the first public declaration she had ever seen him make. And he said, "You found it yourself." She said, "I said I would." He said, "I know. I believed you." He put his hand at the small of her back, and this was also a declaration not possessive, nothing claiming. Just the specific placement of a person who was announcing in the vocabulary of rooms like this that the woman beside him was there with his full knowledge and endorsement, and she felt the room adjust around it. The particular social reorientation of 12 people updating their model simultaneously. Edmund was at the other end of the room, and he looked at Celeste, and she held his gaze for a moment, and he nodded not warmly, but with the specific acknowledgement of Thursday's meeting, the confirmation that they had had a conversation and that it had been real. She nodded back. Darian said, quietly, "My father told me you called him." She said, "I said I would." He said, "You were structurally honest." She said, "He mentioned you used that phrase." He said, "It's accurate." She said, "I know. That's why I didn't argue with it." The meeting was not a dramatic event. It did not have the shape of a confrontation because the confrontation had already happened in the coffee shop, in the documents, in Isadora's phone call on Saturday afternoon. What remained was the formal acknowledgement of the structure that had changed, and the beginning of a conversation about what the new structure would be. Darian presented the documentation, the transaction records, Isadora's testimony about the signature pattern, the full audit of the Eastern Corridor infrastructure, the evidence of the extraction and its attribution to Isadora's father, and he presented it with the same precision he applied to everything, without drama and without the performance of injury, as a sequence of facts that had led to a necessary conclusion. There were questions. There were voices that were not immediately comfortable with the conclusion, and one of them belonged to a man named Hartley, who was a senior figure in the Voss infrastructure, who had been involved in the Rhine negotiations from the beginning, and who said, with the specific authority of someone who had been in the room for every version of this arrangement, that dissolving the Rhine alliance without an established replacement was the kind of action that created the exact situation the alliance was designed to prevent. Celeste was sitting to Darian's left, and she said nothing for a moment while Darian responded to Hartley. And she watched the room, and she thought about the territorial dispute and what it was actually about, which was, when you stripped the alliance and the family relationships and the specific vocabulary of this world away from it, a question about who controlled the distribution infrastructure in the Eastern Corridor and on what terms, she said, into a brief pause in the exchange. The dispute isn't about the alliance. The alliance was a response to the dispute. If the dispute is resolved on its own terms, the alliance becomes unnecessary. Hartley looked at her. Several other people looked at her. Darian looked at her with the expression that was not management, and not the window, and not the completely unguarded version, but something that was all three of those things at once, and that she thought she had not seen before and would need to add to her catalogue. She said, "The Eastern Corridor infrastructure is a distribution problem. What does it take to resolve it operationally?" Without the Rhine family's involvement, the room was quiet. She said, "I'm asking because I don't know the specifics. I'm asking because if it's a distribution problem with a distribution solution, then the dissolution of the alliance becomes a realignment rather than a vulnerability. Hartley looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked at Edmund, and Edmund said, "She's not wrong." Hartley said, "She's not wrong." It was the most unexpected sentence she had heard since she arrived in this room. What followed was not an argument, but a working conversation. The kind that happened when people in a room stopped defending positions and started solving the problem behind the positions. And it went for 2 hours. And Celeste said perhaps 12 more things during those 2 hours, specific things. Things that came from her understanding of logistics and infrastructure, and how systems could be restructured to carry the same load through a different configuration. And at the end of the 2 hours, they had the outline of a resolution that did not require the Rhine alliance, and that was better, structurally, than the alliance had been, because it addressed the actual problem rather than managing the symptom of it, Hartley said, at the end, looking at Celeste with the expression of a man updating a model he had been running for a long time. "Darian, where has she been for the last 9 years?" Darian said. "Boston," she heard in his voice. Behind the word, the specific quality of everything he had not said in 11 months. And she thought that she was going to be hearing the things behind his words for a very long time, and that this was one of the better prospects she had encountered recently. After the formal meeting, there was a period of smaller conversations, and then the room gradually dispersed until it was only Celeste and Darian and Edmund, the 3 of them in the living room of the North Shore house, with the lake visible through the windows and the January afternoon going blue outside. Edmund said, "I'm going to make calls." He stood and he looked at Celeste, and he said, "Thursday." She said, "Thursday." It was, she thought, the entirety of what needed to be said between them right now. And it was enough. He left the room. She and Darian were alone in the living room of the North Shore house for the first time, in this specific configuration. And she thought about the other times she had been in this house, the Sunday mornings that felt like a different version of the life she was now in the middle of, and she thought about how much had changed, and how much was the same, and how much of the same was the part that mattered. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the complete expression, all of it visible, the whole complex structure of who he was when he was not managing it. The grief and the relief and the weight set down, and the particular quality of a man who had arrived at a thing he had been building toward for a very long time, and was surprised to find that the arrival felt different from how he had imagined it. "You talked to Hartley," he said. She said, "Hartley had a real problem. Real problems have solutions." He said, "He's been working on that problem for 9 years." She said, "He was working on the alliance, not the problem." He said, "You figured that out in 20 minutes. She said, "I figured it out in the elevator on Thursday when I had 20 minutes to think about what I was walking into." He looked at her for a long moment. "What else did you figure out in the elevator?" She said, "That your father was going to be the hardest part. Not because he's difficult, but because he loves the thing he built, and he's afraid of what happens to it." He said, and she said, "And that's a thing I understand. So I called him." He said, "I know. He told me." He said, "You told him you were going to be in his family's life for a very long time, whether he was comfortable with it or not." She said, "Did he mind that I said it that way?" He said it was the most structurally honest sentence he had heard in years, and that he was beginning to understand what I meant. She said, "Good." She looked at the lake through the windows. She said, "I told him he was quiet." She did not look at him. She looked at the lake in January. The specific color of it, iron and blue. She said, "He didn't say much, but he received it. You could see the weight of it landing." He said, "A granddaughter." she said. Yes. He was quiet for a long moment. She heard him move. And then he was standing beside her at the window, looking at the same lake. And she said, "What are you thinking?" He said, "I'm thinking about the drawings at the North Shore house. In the study, my mother made drawings when she was pregnant. Architectural drawings of the house. All the proportions. Every room. She said she wanted the baby to know the space from the inside." She turned and looked at him. He was looking at the lake. She said, "I didn't know your mother was an architect." He said, "She wasn't. She was an economist. But she understood space." Celeste looked at him for a moment. She thought about the drawings and the economist mother who had understood space. And she thought about the baby who was going to be born, knowing the specific geometry of whatever space they were in because she had been in. The space of this entire situation, all of it. The 11 months, and the arrangement, and the 48 hours, and the coffee shop, and the freight elevator, and the 3rd floor with the steel channel load path, and she thought that this child was going to arrive into a world that was not without complication, but that had been organized by 2 people who were very good at building things, as well as it could be organized. "Tell me about the drawings," she said. He told her. And outside the North Shore house window, the January lake held itself in its particular winter color, neither gray nor blue, but some quality that was both. And the conversation continued in the way that conversations continued when they were finally the right conversation at the right time between the right people, unhurried, specific, honest. The particular quality of 2 people who had been building toward each other for a long time, finally standing in the same room. She stayed for dinner. This had not been planned. It happened because the conversation moved into the kitchen, and then food materialized in the way that food materialized in the North Shore house, precisely and without ceremony. Darian cooking with the focused attention he applied to everything he cared about, and she stood at the counter and talked to him while he cooked. And this was so familiar from the North Shore Sunday mornings of the previous spring and summer that she felt the familiarity of it like a structural thing, a load path she recognized, something the body knew before the mind had processed it. She said, from the counter, "The residential conversion." He said, "What about it?" She said, "I want to name the building." He said, "It's your building. You name it." She said, "I mean in the foundation documents. What the project is officially called." He said, "What do you want to call it?" She said, "I don't know yet. I'll know when I've been inside it more." He said, "That's a good answer." She said, "It's the honest one." He said, "Those are usually the same thing." She looked at him at the stove, and she thought about 11 months, and room 14, and the trust account, and the freight elevator, and the family meeting, and Hartley and Edmund and Isadora's voice on the phone saying, "Good luck with your building." And she thought about a man who said, "I love you" in load-bearing infrastructure, and who was standing at a stove in January making dinner with the focused attention of someone who was doing the thing they were made to do, which was take care of the specific person in the room. And she thought that she had spent a year being not taken care of by someone who had been very good at performing the opposite, and that the specificity of this, the dinner, the counter, the November call, the 3-day rhythm, the hand in the dark of the River North apartment was the difference between performance and architecture, and that she had spent her entire professional life being able to tell the difference. And she was going to trust that now. She said, "After dinner, I'm going back to the hotel. I have an early meeting tomorrow." He said, "I know." She said, "But come by the building this week, whenever you're free." He said, Name a day, she said. Wednesday. Afternoon, he said. I'll be there, she said. I know you will. He looked up from the stove and looked at her across the kitchen, and she thought about the window expression and the management and the complete unguarded version, and she thought that the version she was looking at now was different from all three of those. It was the version that existed when a person was in a space that was entirely theirs, and the person they were with was entirely welcome, which was the most fundamental form of being at home that she knew of. And she thought that she was going to spend a great deal of time in this kitchen. She picked up her glass of water. She said, Darian, he said. Yes, she said. I forgive the trust account. He was quiet for a moment. He said, You don't have to, I know. She said, I'm choosing to. He looked at her for a long moment. He said, I'm not going to manage you anymore. She said, You're going to try not to. That's the honest version. He said, Yes, that's the honest version. She said, I'll take the honest version. He said, I know. She said, Don't say it like you're surprised. He said, I'm not surprised. He stopped. She waited. He stepped past it. Grateful, he said. She held that word in the way she held load calculations, with the specific attention its weight warranted, without letting it become more or less than what it was. Eat dinner with me, she said. He said, That's what I'm making. She said, I know. Stop narrating and cook. He did. She stayed at the counter. The North Shore house held them both in its January evening quiet, and the lake was out there in the dark doing what the lake did. And the baby that was going to be named when Celeste understood her well enough to name her was doing whatever babies did at 18 weeks, which Celeste had been reading about, and which apparently involved a great deal of movement that she had not yet felt, but that her OB assured her was coming. And she thought about all of it, the movement coming, the name coming, the building coming, the conversation they had finally had, and the conversation they were going to keep having, and she thought that the most honest thing she could say about where she was right now was that she was in exactly the right building. After dinner she put on her coat, and he walked her out to the car she had called, and they stood at the end of the North Shore driveway in the January cold, with the lake behind the house and the road in front of it, and he said, Boston, she said, I'll be going back next week. 2 weeks. And then I'll come back for the residential conversion site work. He said, and between, she said, the calls. Every 3 days seems to be our rhythm. He said, I can call every day. She said, I know. 3 days is enough. He said, You're sure? She looked at him in the January dark of the North Shore driveway, with the cold and the lake and the light from the house behind him. And she said, I'm sure because every 3 days I have something to say that I didn't have before. If we talked every day, we'd run out of what's real and start performing the conversation. He looked at her. He said, That might be the most accurate thing you've ever said about us. She said, I say accurate things regularly. He said, I know. I've been listening for 11 months. She said, Then you know I mean it. He said, I know. The car was there at the end of the driveway. Idling. And she picked up her bag, and she looked at him one more time, and she said, Wednesday, 3 o'clock, 3rd floor. He said, I'll be there at 3. She said, Be there at 2:50. I want to show you something before we go up. He said, What is it? She said, Something on the 1st floor. The original load-bearing system. It's intact, and it's more sophisticated than anything in the documentation suggests. He said, The documentation is always conservative. She said, Right, but the actual structure usually exceeds it. She held his gaze for a moment, and she thought about all the things she had meant to say and had said in their own way. Through the calls and the counter and the Wednesday appointments, and the specific shared language of two people who said what they meant when they had found the right words for it, which sometimes took longer than it should and was worth the wait. She got in the car. The car moved down the North Shore Road. She did not look back, because she did not need to. She knew he was watching the car until it turned. In the specific way she knew the things she had learned about him in 11 months. From the inside of the pattern rather than from the description of it. She looked forward. She looked at the road, and the city ahead of it, and the building on the West Loop corner that was going to be exceptional. And she looked at all of it in the January dark, with the specific quality of attention she gave to things she was committed to, which was not admiration, not sentiment, but the honest acknowledgement of a thing that was worth the weight it was going to carry, and the certainty that it would. She called Nina from the car. Nina answered immediately, which meant she had been waiting. "Tell me," Nina said. Celeste said. "The family meeting happened," Nina said, and Celeste said. "And it went the way it was going to go when the right structure was in place," Nina said. "That is a completely uninformative sentence," Celeste said. "I know. What I mean is that it's okay. It's going to be complicated and it's going to take time to build properly, and there are things about it that are going to be difficult and things about it that are going to be extraordinary," Nina said. "And him," specifically him, Celeste looked at the North Shore Road going past. She thought about the stove and the counter, and "I'm grateful," and Wednesday at 2:50, and the documentation is always conservative. She said, "Specifically him is the most structurally honest person I've ever tried to have a relationship with." Nina said, "That's either a great answer or a deeply concerning one." Celeste said, "It's both. That's usually how the true answers work." Nina was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Are you happy?" Celeste thought about the question. She thought about the specific quality of what she was feeling, which was not happiness in the light, easy sense, but something denser and more load-bearing, the feeling of a structure that was holding what it was designed to hold, of a plan that was proceeding not according to the original blueprint, but according to the actual conditions of the site, which were always more interesting than the blueprint had imagined. She said, "I'm building something," Nina said. "That's not," Celeste said. "For me it is. For me that's the same thing." Nina was quiet again, and then she said, "Okay," Celeste said. "Okay." They hung up. The car moved through the January Chicago dark. She put her hand on her abdomen in the way she had started doing, without thinking the way she had done it at the river apartment window before she knew Darian was coming. The private acknowledgement of the specific presence she was carrying, and she thought about what she was going to tell her daughter about this someday, and she thought that the honest version was always the right version, even when it was complicated, especially when it was complicated, because the buildings that were built honestly on honest foundations were the ones that lasted past the documentation, and that was what she was building. And that was what she was going to teach her daughter to build, in whatever form she found for it, something that was true, something that bore its load, something that exceeded what anyone had written down about what it could hold. She did not have the words for it yet. She was going to have them when she had been inside it long enough to understand the space. That was how it always worked, with the things that mattered, and she had never been afraid of the time it took. She looked out the car window at Chicago in January, at the buildings going past with their lit windows and their century-old bones, and their loads, distributed through systems that had been engineered by people who understood their materials from the inside. And she thought this city, this building, this person, this daughter, coming in the spring, like something the foundations had been expecting, even when none of the documentation said so. She thought yes. She closed her eyes. The car moved through the city, outside the windows. Chicago held itself up in the specific, stubborn, beautiful way it always did, imperfectly, expensively, in the full knowledge that everything worth building cost more than the original estimate and lasted longer than anyone predicted, and was worth every calculation it had taken to get there. She spent the following week in a rhythm that was different from any week she had inhabited before, and she thought that this was because it was the first week in which the structure she was building had become, in its essential shape, visible. Not complete. It would not be complete for years, possibly ever, because the best structures were always being adjusted for new load but visible. The way a building becomes visible when the framing is up, and you can finally see what it has always been trying to be. She was at the West Loop building every morning. She called Darian at 3 days intervals, and the calls were different now. Different in the specific way of calls between people who have said the important thing and are now talking about everything else, which was its own kind of intimacy, the intimacy of ordinary life shared, rather than the intimacy of crisis managed. He told her about a meeting with his father that had gone better than either of them had expected. Edmund, apparently, had reached out to a contact in the Eastern Corridor infrastructure on Monday, 2 days after the family meeting, to begin the operational resolution that Celeste had outlined quietly, without announcement, the way Edmund Voss did most things that he had decided to do. He didn't mention it to me, Darian said. On the Thursday call, Hartley told me. She said, "Your father moves faster than he presents." He said, "He always has." She said, "Where do you think you got it?" A pause. "From my mother," he said, and she heard something in it that was warm and specifically placed. The way people mentioned the dead when they are both honoring them and claiming them. "Tell me about her," Celeste said. He told her. Her name had been Clara, and she had been an economist who had also been a reader and a person who organized her physical environment with the same precision she applied to quantitative models, which meant that the North Shore house had the quality it had because she had built it, room by room. In the decade before she got sick, he had been 21 when she died, old enough to remember her completely, young enough that the absence had become part of the architecture of who he was, rather than something that could be distinguished from it. Celeste listened to the whole thing, and when he finished, she said, "She would have been very good at room 14. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I think that constantly," she said. "I know." She did not know why she knew. She just did. She held the knowledge the way she held the load of the conversation carefully, with the attention it warranted. Wednesday arrived. She was at the West Loop building at 2:45, which meant she was there before him, which was what she had planned. She stood on the first floor in the original structural bay of the building, and she looked at what she had been wanting to show him, the original load-bearing system, which was not just intact, but was extraordinarily sophisticated for its era. A hybrid system that combined masonry-bearing walls with a cast-iron column grid that was so precisely calibrated for the loads of the industrial use that it had remained structurally sound for 120 years, with almost no remediation. She had found it on her 3rd day in the building and had spent 2 mornings documenting it, and had sent the documentation to a structural engineering historian at Illinois Tech, who had confirmed that it was one of the best preserved examples of its type in the Midwest. It was going to be the central organizational element of the adaptive reuse. The new design would expose it rather than hide it. Turn the century of load. It had born into the thing you looked at when you entered the space. Make the structure the subject instead of the background. She heard the freight elevator at 2:52, and Darian stepped out onto the first floor, and she said, "Look up." He looked up. He looked at the cast-iron column grid and the original capitals and the way the grid extended into the space and organized it, and he was quiet for a long time. The specific quiet of someone who understood what they were looking at. He said, "It's been here the whole time." She said, "Yes." He said, "Under everything they put on top of it." She said, "The layers didn't compromise it. If anything, some of them protected it." He looked at the grid for another long moment, and then he looked at her, and she thought that he was not only looking at the column grid anymore. She said, "The new design exposes it. Everything we build in here is going to be organized around this. The load path is already here. We're just making it visible." He said, "What does visible mean?" "Architecturally," she said. "It means that the thing that was holding everything up is the thing you can see. The structure becomes the architecture." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly right." She said, "I know." She looked at the column grid and then at him, and she thought about all the things that had been holding things up that were not visible yet, and that she was. Slowly, systematically, in the specific way she had learned in 5 years of adaptive reuse work. Making visible. She thought, this is what we're doing, not just in the building. She said, "Let me show you the 3rd floor." He said, "Lead the way." She led the way. He followed. They walked the building for 2 hours, and when they left at 5 and stood on the West Loop corner with the January late afternoon light going gold on the brick, she said, "The residential conversion, the one 3 blocks from here." He said, "Yes." She said, "I want to use the same principle. Whatever's holding it up, whatever the original structure is, I want to find it and expose it and build around it." He looked at her. He said, "Do you want to walk over?" She said. "It's getting dark." He said, "We'll use the flashlights on our phones." She said, "That's not how you do a proper structural assessment." He said, "No," he agreed. "But it's how you do a first look at something you're about to commit to." She looked at him. She thought about first looks and committing. She said, "All right." They walked 3 blocks in the January cold and stood outside the residential conversion building, and she looked at it from the outside in the dusk, and she thought about what was inside it and what it could become, and who was going to be in the space when it was finished. The residents who didn't know yet that this building was going to organize itself around their lives, the way good buildings always did. She said, "It's going to be exceptional." He said, "I know." She said, "How do you know?" "You haven't been inside." He said, "Because you're going to build it." She looked at him. She thought about all the structural ways people said things that mattered, all the load-bearing forms of "I believe in you" that weren't those words. She said, "Come back Thursday. Bring the original drawings if you can get them from the permit office. I want to start from what was already there." He said, "I'll get them." She said, "Thursday morning." He said, "What time?" She said, 8. "Early. I want the light." He said, "I'll bring coffee." She said, "I already have a spot." He said, "I know you do." She looked at the building one more time in the January dusk. She thought about what it was going to be. She thought about the column grid and the century of load and the structure becoming the architecture. She thought about a girl who was going to be born in the spring and who was already organizing the space around her in ways that Celeste was only beginning to understand. And she thought that the 2 buildings, the West Loop conversion and the residential building in front of her, and the life she was building in the space between them were all the same project, which was the project of making the load-bearing things visible and building around them honestly. She said, "Thursday." He said, "Thursday." They walked back to the West Loop in the January dark, and she thought that this was what it felt like to be in the right building, not finished, not without its structural problems, not simpler than it actually was, but oriented correctly, facing the right direction, built on the foundation that was actually there, rather than the one the documentation had described. The spring came, the way spring came in Chicago abruptly, after a winter that had seemed to have no intention of ending, with the specific quality of a city remembering what it was like before the cold. The West Loop building was in construction by March, and Celeste had moved to Chicago in February, into an apartment in the West Loop that was 3 blocks from the building, and that she had found herself and signed herself, and that had good light from the south windows and a second bedroom that she was painting very slowly on the weekends, trying different colors and none of them entirely right, yet, which her OB said was completely normal for 26 weeks, and which Celeste attributed to the fact that she had not yet found the color that was accurate for the specific person who was going to be in the room. And she was not going to guess. Nina came in March for a week and met Darian on the second day, which went better than either of them admitted, and Nina said afterward, privately, to Celeste, "He looks at you like you're a structural problem he's very glad to have." And Celeste said, "I know." And Nina said, "I like him," which was the most important thing Nina had said about anyone Celeste had been involved with in 8 years. And Celeste filed it in the category of things she was not going to examine too directly because they were already load-bearing and she did not want to disrupt the distribution. Edmund came to the West Loop building in April with a man who turned out to be the structural engineering historian from Illinois Tech, which Celeste had not arranged and which Edmund had arranged himself, apparently after Darian had mentioned the cast-iron column grid. And the historian and Celeste talked for 2 hours on the first floor about the original system and the adaptive reuse design, while Edmund stood at the edge of the conversation and listened with the specific quality of attention she had first observed in him in the Thursday meeting in Streeterville. And at the end of the 2 hours, he said to Celeste, "The column capitals, the original ones on the perimeter bays, are they going to be preserved in the final design?" she said. "Everyone," he said. "Good." And she thought that this was Edmund Voss saying, "I'm proud of what you're building," in the language of a man who had built things all his life and knew how to talk about the ones that were worth building. She said, "Thank you for coming." He said, "Darian said the grid was worth seeing." She said, "It is." He said, "Yes." And he looked at it one more time with the expression of a man who understood the value of things that had been holding up more than anyone expected, for longer than anyone had documented. And she thought that this was also Edmund talking about his family, and about the situation, and about the woman who was going to bring his granddaughter into the world in 6 weeks. And she received all of it in the way it was offered precisely, without embellishment, with the specific honesty of a language she was learning and would spend a long time becoming fluent in. The daughter arrived on a Thursday in May, which Celeste thought was appropriate, because Thursday was the day she and Edmund had met, and Thursday was the day Darian had been at the West Loop building, and Thursday was the day that good things happened when they had been properly built for. She was born at the same hospital where Celeste had been receiving prenatal care, in a room that had a window with a view of the city. And Darian was there, and Nina was there, and the baby arrived the way babies arrived when they were ready, sudden and absolute and entirely certain of taking up space, exactly as Celeste had predicted at the anatomy scan. They held her together for the first time in the hospital room with the city visible through the window, and Nina crying in the chair in the corner, and the particular quiet of a room that has just become 4 people instead of 3. And Darian looked at the baby and he said nothing for a long time. And Celeste looked at him, looking at the baby, and she thought about October, the day after the test. The beginning of room 14. The 4 months of invisible construction, and she thought about the specific quality of a man who had been building toward this for 4 months, in the specific vocabulary of his world, and who was now holding it, and had run out of vocabulary entirely and was only present, the way the North Shore house had been only present on Sunday mornings before the week arrived with its requirements, the way the West Loop building was only itself when you stood in it before the construction began, and there was nothing between you and the bones. She said, "Her name." He looked at her. She said, "I know her name now that I can see her." He said, "Tell me." She said, "Clara." He was quiet for a moment that was long enough to hold everything it needed to hold. And then he said, "Yes," the way he said yes to things that were simply true, with the cleanness of a fact rather than the weight of an agreement. She said, "Yes." He said, "Yes, Clara." He looked at the baby and she looked at him looking at the baby, and she thought, this is the load-bearing thing, not the trust account or the dissolution of the arrangement or the family meeting or even the coffee shop or the freight elevator. This, right here. This Thursday in May, in a hospital room with a city view and a baby named for a woman who had organized her environment with the same precision she applied to quantitative models. This was what it had all been built for. She thought, I know what I'm building now. I've known since October. I just didn't have the name for it yet. She thought, I have the name for it now. She held her daughter. She looked at Darian. He looked at her. The city was visible through the window in the specific May light that Chicago saved for days when it wanted to remind you why you stayed. And the building 3 blocks from here was framed and rising, and the bones of it were everything she had hoped they would be, and the load path was exactly right. And the column grid on the first floor of the West Loop building was going to be the first thing you saw when you walked in the door. And the structure was the architecture. And the thing that had been holding everything up was finally, honestly, visibly there. Peace, she thought, was not the absence of weight. It was the knowledge that the weight was distributed correctly, through a structure that had been built to hold it, by people who had been honest about what they were building and why. She had spent a year learning this from the inside. She was going to spend a long time building on it. She thought that was the right kind of long time to be looking at. And she held her daughter in the May light, and she looked at the man across the room who had built for her before she knew she needed building for. And she thought, yes, this, here, the load is right. The structure will hold.